Movement 1. The Quality of Silence. Part 1. Before we begin, a confession. There is a kind of silence that feels different from other silences. You know the silence of an empty room, the absence of sound, the neutrality of air, the simple fact of nothing happening. That silence is comfortable. It is the silence of a blank page, of a held breath, of the moment before a decision is made. It costs nothing. It demands nothing. You can enter it and leave it without carrying anything out that you did not carry in. There is another silence. It is the silence of a place that has been holding something for a very long time. You encounter this silence in old buildings sometimes. Not all old buildings, not even most of them, but specific ones, particular ones. Buildings that have been present long enough and witnessed enough that they seem to have developed something resembling interiority, a quality of containment. As though the walls have absorbed the centuries and are still processing them, quietly, the way the body processes trauma long after the event has ended. This second silence has weight. It presses back when you enter it. It makes you aware of the scale of time in a way that daylight and conversation and the ordinary business of living do not allow. It makes you small, not insignificantly small, not insultingly small, but small in the way that standing at the edge of a continent and looking out at the water makes you small. The smallness is appropriate. It is the correct response to the scale of what you are in the presence of. Most people, when they encounter this silence, feel compelled to break it. They speak, or they shuffle their feet, or they take out a phone and capture an image that will later seem inadequate, because no image can contain what the silence was actually saying. No photograph holds the weight of it. No recording catches the specific quality of air in a space that has not been entered by living people for 1,000 years. I have spent a great deal of my life seeking out this silence. Not for spiritual reasons, not for tourism, not for the academic satisfaction of discovery, though all of these have been part of it at different moments. I have sought it because I have come to believe, after a long time and much evidence, that the silence of these places is not random. It is not merely the residue of age and abandonment. It is something that was put there deliberately, by people who understood something about silence that we have, in our loud and accelerating world, forgotten. The silence is the message. What follows is my attempt to read it. Part 2. The Library of What Has Been Lost. Before we go to specific places, I want to establish something. The world that we know, the historical world, the world of recorded civilization, of alphabets and cities and agriculture, and bronze and iron and clay tablets covered in cuneiform, is extraordinarily young. Modern Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, have existed for approximately 300,000 years. Our oldest confirmed written records are around 5,000 years old. Our oldest confirmed cities are perhaps 9,000 years old. This means that for roughly 97% of our existence as a species, we left no record that we have found and can read. This is not because nothing happened. 300,000 years is an incomprehensible span of time. It is long enough for entire mountain ranges to shift, long enough for coastlines to transform beyond recognition, and indeed they have. During the last ice age, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Coastlines that are now submerged were once inhabited. Plains that are now ocean floors were once grasslands, river valleys, forests. Hundreds of thousands of years of human experience occurred in landscapes that no longer exist in the form they had when humans walked them. What did the people who lived in those places leave behind? Some of it undoubtedly is gone, dissolved, compressed, consumed by geological time. But some things survive. Stone survives. Certain kinds of fired clay survive. Deep cave systems survive, protected from weather and erosion and the grinding advance of ice. And what we find in these surviving places, when we find it, when we recognize it as worth finding, is so far beyond what our existing models predict that we have developed, as a scholarly community, a practiced inability to look at it directly. This is not conspiracy. I want to be very clear about that. This is not a story about suppression or cover-up or malicious gatekeeping, though all of those things exist in their smaller ways in every human institution. This is a story about a much simpler and more universal phenomenon, the difficulty of seeing something that your existing framework has no category for. When you do not have a word for something, you cannot easily discuss it. When you do not have a theoretical model that accounts for something, you cannot easily study it. When the thing you have found does not fit into the narrative that your discipline has spent generations constructing, the path of least resistance, not dishonest path, not corrupt path, just the path of least resistance, is to set it aside, to note it as an anomaly, to publish a paper that is very careful and very hedged and acknowledges the problem without proposing a solution that would require dismantling too many comfortable certainties. The anomalies accumulate. They sit in archives and field notebooks and the private correspondence of scholars who died with their questions unanswered. They wait. This documentary is, among other things, an attempt to read some of those accumulated anomalies together, to hold them up against each other and see whether, in combination, they say something that each one alone was too quiet to say. I believe they do. I believe the thing they say is this: we have been here before. Not we specifically, not this culture, not this particular iteration of complex civilized human life, but something like us, something human or near human, or the precursor to what became us, was doing something in this world on a very large scale for a very long time, and we have almost entirely forgotten that it happened. Almost, but not quite. The stone remembers. The symbols remember. The myths remember, in their oblique and careful way, like a person who witnessed something they were told never to speak of directly, and so speaks of it only sideways, in parable and metaphor and ritual, hoping that someone will eventually be listening carefully enough to understand. I have been listening carefully for a long time. This is what I have heard. Part 3. On the method of this journey. We will travel, in the course of this documentary, to more than 30 sites across 6 continents. Some of these sites are well known to archaeologists and historians, though rarely to general audiences. Others are known only to local communities, to a handful of researchers, or to no one at all in the formal academic sense. Some exist in published literature. Some exist only in private correspondence, field notebooks, or oral tradition. The journey is not linear. We do not begin in one place and walk in a straight line to a conclusion. The journey is more like reading a text in a language you are only beginning to understand. You make your way from symbol to symbol, and sometimes a symbol that confused you in an early passage becomes clear when you encounter it again later in a different context. And sometimes a passage that seemed perfectly clear early on reveals, when you return to it later, a depth that you initially missed. This is how these mysteries work. They reward patience. They punish the desire for premature resolution. They are structured, and I do believe they are structured, though I cannot tell you by whom or by what, in a way that requires you to hold a great deal of apparently unrelated information in suspension before the relationships between them become visible. So, I ask for your patience. Some of what I describe early in this account will seem to lack context. Some connections will seem tentative or circumstantial. I ask you to hold those open threads and carry them with you, because they will be needed later, in places you cannot yet anticipate. The thread of every mystery is the same thread. We are following it from different ends. Movement 2. The Plateau of Forgotten Names. Part 1. The Ustyurt Plateau, Before Dawn. The Ustyurt Plateau stretches across what is now western Kazakhstan and parts of Uzbekistan, a vast, elevated tableland, approximately 200,000 square kilometers of near featureless terrain, bounded to the west by the cliffs that drop into the lowlands around the Caspian Sea, and to the east by the retreating remains of the Aral Sea. It is a landscape of extreme simplicity, flat, pale, wind-scored. The rock is the color of old bone. The sky above it is enormous in a way that skies in more populated places rarely are, because there is nothing on the plateau to interrupt your vision in any direction, and so the horizon is complete, a perfect circle of which you are the center. In summer, the plateau is merciless. Temperatures rise above 50 degrees Celsius on the surface of the rock, and the wind that moves across it is not cooling, but simply kinetic. It moves heat rather than displacing it. In winter, the same wind arrives from the north, carrying temperatures that fall to -30, and the plateau becomes a different kind of merciless, pale and frozen and implacable. Almost no one lives on the Ustyurt Plateau. There is almost no water. There is almost no shade. The nearest populations cluster at the edges, in the lower terrain where rivers or wells provide what the plateau itself withholds. The plateau itself is crossed, occasionally, by roads, thin and improbable looking, like scratches on the pale rock, but it is not inhabited. It has not been inhabited in any permanent way for a very long time. It was not always empty. The evidence for earlier habitation on the Ustyurt Plateau is scattered and largely unexamined. There are remnants of what may have been nomadic encampments, though identifying encampment sites from cultures that left no permanent structures requires a quality of attention that most surveys of the plateau, conducted quickly in uncomfortable conditions for purposes unrelated to archaeology, have not brought to bear. There are petroglyphs carved into rock faces and boulders that have been cataloged but not extensively studied. There are, according to certain Soviet-era geological survey reports that have never been fully translated or analyzed outside Russian-speaking academic circles, anomalous stone arrangements in several locations across the plateau's interior. The first serious attempt to document these stone arrangements was made, accidentally, in the spring of 1968. Part 2. Voronov's Notebook. Dmitry Alexandrovich Voronov was 34 years old in 1968. He was a geologist employed by the Soviet state's Mineral Survey Program, assigned to the Ustyurt Plateau as part of a broader effort to identify exploitable mineral deposits in the remote territories of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. He was not an archaeologist. He had no training in cultural heritage documentation. He was, by all accounts from colleagues who knew him, a practical and literal-minded man who understood rocks in terms of their mineral composition and their economic potential, not their cultural or historical significance. He was also, fortunately, a thorough note-taker. His field notebook from the spring 1968 survey season is now held in the National Archive in Almaty. It runs to 237 pages of densely written, technically precise observations, soil compositions, rock strata, mineral identifications, GPS coordinates in the Soviet military grid system, weather conditions, equipment readings. For more than 200 pages, it is exactly what you would expect from a competent geological survey of the Ustyurt Plateau: practical, uninspired, complete. On page 214, dated the 23rd of April 1968, there is a break in the geological record. Voronov has written, in a handwriting that is slightly less controlled than his usual precise script, as though he wrote it quickly or with some distraction, the following: The sketch is on the facing page. It is rough. Voronov was not a draftsman, but several things are clear. The slabs are large. The sketch's scale bar suggesting each is between 4 and 6 meters across. They are arranged not randomly, but in a pattern that Voronov has attempted to capture from what appears to be a rough elevated vantage point. The arrangement is approximately oval. Within the oval, the slabs are distributed at irregular intervals that nonetheless suggest intentionality. They are not randomly scattered, and they are not in a simple geometric pattern like a grid or a circle. They are in something more complex than that, something that Voronov, with his geological training, has noted but not attempted to interpret. In the lower right corner of the sketch, he has made a small additional drawing, a close-up of the markings on the uppermost slab, the one closest to his vantage point. It is a small drawing, perhaps 5 centimeters across in the original. It shows a series of nested curves, arcs within arcs, like the growth rings of a tree in cross-section, but irregular, asymmetrical, with the spacing between arcs varying in what might be random variation or might be deliberate modulation. Along the outer arc, small vertical marks are spaced at intervals that appear consistent. He made a note beneath this small drawing. Cannot identify, unlike any geological feature I know, appears intentional. That was the end of Voronov's engagement with the site. His next entry, dated the following day, is back to geological survey data, mineral readings, soil samples, nothing more. He noted coordinates for the stone arrangement in his coordinates log, the separate booklet he maintained for GPS recordings. That booklet was not archived with the field notebook. It has never been located. Whether it was lost in the filing process, removed by someone who noticed what it contained, or simply misfiled somewhere in the vast Soviet archival system and awaits eventual rediscovery, is not known. Voronov completed his survey, returned to his institute in what was then Alma-Ata, filed his report, and spent the next 23 years continuing his geological career. He retired in 1991, the year the Soviet Union dissolved. He died in 1999 in Almaty. He mentioned the stone arrangement to a colleague once at a professional conference in 1973, a throwaway comment over dinner, the kind of odd footnote that gets shared in the informal spaces around formal scientific gatherings. His colleague did not follow up, neither did anyone else. The site remained unvisited, as far as any record indicates, for 35 years. Part 3. The 2003 Expedition. The story of how the Naru Tash complex was rediscovered, for that is the name it eventually acquired, from a Kazakh phrase meaning the place the horses refuse, a name given to it by local herding communities who had always known it was there and had always, by unspoken agreement, not entered it, is a story of the kind of patient, obsessive, cross-referential work that actual archaeological discovery, as opposed to the dramatized version, usually requires. In 2001, a graduate student at the Al-Farabi Kazakh National University in Almaty named Arman Jaksibekov was working on a dissertation about Soviet-era archaeological survey practices in Kazakhstan. Specifically, the ways in which Soviet geological surveys had incidentally documented archaeological sites that were then not followed up because they fell outside the survey's economic mandate. He was working through archived field notebooks from the 1960s and 1970s, a task that required reading through thousands of pages of geological data looking for the kind of anomalous entries that Voronov had made. He found Voronov's notebook in the spring of 2002. He recognized immediately that the entry on page 214 described something significant. He could not, from the sketch alone, determine what it described. The drawing was too rough, the context too sparse. But he was persistent. He spent 6 months attempting to reconstruct Voronov's survey route from the geographical references in the notebook, cross-referencing with Soviet military maps of the plateau, attempting to narrow down the area in which the coordinates Voronov had noted, but not preserved, must have fallen. He narrowed it to an area of approximately 300 square kilometers. This sounds like a lot. On the Ustyurt Plateau, with its flat terrain and its absence of landmarks, 300 square kilometers is a manageable search area for aerial photography. He applied through the university for access to Soviet military aerial photograph archives covering the Ustyurt Plateau. The application took 14 months to process. In the spring of 2003, he received a partial release, aerial photographs of the plateau taken in 1971 at a resolution sufficient to identify large surface features. He found the site in the photographs on the third day of examining them. From the air, at the altitude and resolution of the 1971 photographs, the arrangement of the Naru Tash slabs was unmistakable. Not because any individual slab was particularly prominent. They were large, but the plateau was vast, and they did not stand dramatically above the surface. They were unmistakable because of their relationship to each other. Because, when seen from above, the 17 slabs arranged themselves into a pattern that was clearly not random and clearly not geological. Jaksibekov sat looking at the photograph for a long time. Then he called a colleague at a German university, a woman named Dr. Helene Meyer, an archaeoastronomer who had worked on Bronze Age astronomical alignments in Central Asia and with whom he had corresponded about the broader project of his dissertation. He described what he was seeing, and she asked him to send a scan of the photograph. She called him back the same evening. "I need to come and see this," she said, "and I need to bring my mapping software." The joint Kazakh-German expedition of 2003 consisted of 6 people: Jaksibekov, Dr. Meyer, 2 Kazakh archaeological assistants, a German photographic technician, and a local guide from the nearest settled community who had agreed to show them the route to the site, but who declined, on arrival, to approach closer than approximately 200 meters. The guide's name was Kairat. He was in his 60s, a weathered, laconic man who had spent his life moving cattle across the plateau's margins. He knew the Naru Tash site, as did every herding family in the region. He had known of it since childhood, when his grandmother had described it to him in terms that he translated for the expedition's benefit as the stones that were placed by the people before people. He was asked if he could be more specific about what that phrase meant. He considered the question for a while, looking out at the pale terrain. "It means before us," he said, "before our people came here, the people before people." He would not approach the site. He waited at the vehicles, and when the expedition returned at the end of the day, he examined their faces for something, some change in expression that might tell him whether they had found what he seemed to know was there. Whatever he saw in their faces apparently satisfied something in him, because he was quiet for a long time on the drive back. Then he said in Kazakh something that Jaksibekov translated later as, "You have seen the question. Good luck finding the answer." Part 4. The Astronomical Correspondence. Dr. Helene Meyer's analysis of the Naru Tash site was published in June of 2005 in the Jahrbuch für Archäoastronomie, a small Viennese journal dedicated to the overlap between astronomy and archaeology. The paper was called Possible Astronomical Encoding in a Megalithic Context from the Ustyurt Plateau of Kazakhstan, a preliminary survey. It ran to 31 pages and was accompanied by 12 photographs, 6 diagrams, and an extensive statistical appendix. The paper received modest attention within the narrow field of archaeoastronomy. It received essentially no attention outside it. This is, in retrospect, remarkable, because what the paper described was, by any reasonable standard of judgment, extraordinary. The Naru Tash slabs, Dr. Mayer's analysis showed, were not arranged randomly, and they were not arranged in any of the simple geometric patterns, circle, square, avenue, alignment, that characterize most known megalithic sites. They were arranged in a pattern that corresponded, with a precision that exceeded any plausible level of coincidence, to the configuration of a specific group of stars. Not a famous group, not a constellation that any existing culture has named, so far as Dr. Mayer could determine after exhaustive cross-referencing of star catalog data with known constellation traditions from across the world. The stars in question are a scattered grouping in the southern sky, visible from the Ust-Yurt Plateau's latitude, but not prominent, not the kind of grouping that would immediately draw the eye or invite naming. They are unremarkable in the modern night sky unless you know what you are looking for. What the software showed Dr. Mayer was that the correspondence between the Naru Tash stone arrangement and this star grouping was not a correspondence to how those stars appear in the sky today. It was a correspondence to how those stars appeared from that precise location on the Ust-Yurt Plateau during a specific period in the deep past. Precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the apparent positions of stars to shift over long periods, means that the night sky looks different depending on when you are observing it. The shift is gradual, roughly 1 degree every 72 years, but over millennia it accumulates. The night sky of 10,000 years ago looked meaningfully different from the night sky of today. When Dr. Mayer ran the precession calculations backward, she found that the Naru Tash stone arrangement corresponded precisely to the star grouping as it appeared between approximately 11,000 and 12,000 years before the present. The margin of error in her calculation, accounting for the imprecision of the stone placement measurements, was approximately 500 years. This placed the creation of the Naru Tash complex, if her interpretation was correct, in the late Pleistocene or very early Holocene, a period before any settled civilization, before agriculture, before ceramics. A period that, by current archaeological consensus, was occupied by hunter-gatherer societies with no capacity for the kind of organized, large-scale labor that moving and placing 17 multi-ton stone slabs would require. In the private letter she wrote to a colleague at the University of Edinburgh shortly after submitting the paper, a letter that was later shared, with her permission, in a small, privately circulated collection of correspondence about anomalous archaeological findings, she expressed what the paper's careful academic language had not allowed her to say directly. Quote, "The probability of this being coincidental is, by my calculation, less than 1 in 400 million. I have run the calculation 8 times using different statistical models, and the result does not change significantly. Someone stood on the Ust-Yurt Plateau 11,000 years ago, looked up at those stars, and then looked down at the rock and said, 'I am going to make that permanent. I am going to fix that pattern in stone.' And they did, with an accuracy that I find genuinely difficult to account for, because reproducing this precision today would require surveying equipment and astronomical tables and computational tools that nobody had 11,000 years ago. Or, and this is the possibility that I cannot quite bring myself to write in the paper itself, nobody was supposed to have." The letter continues, "What haunts me is not the precision, it is the choice of stars. The grouping is not significant, as I say in the paper. It does not correspond to any constellation in any tradition I know. It is not Cassiopeia, or Orion, or the Pleiades, or the Southern Cross. It is not part of any navigational star system, not part of any seasonal calendar system, not part of any mythology I have encountered in 6 years of working in this field. It is a grouping of 7 modest stars in the southern sky that, as far as I can determine, no human culture has ever named or assigned meaning to. And yet, someone 11,000 years ago considered this grouping important enough to immortalize in 17 multi-ton stones on a plateau that almost no one has ever visited. There is a possibility that I have not included in the paper because I cannot prove it, and it would not survive peer review as stated. The possibility is this: what if the grouping is not being recorded because it is astronomically significant, because it is a useful navigation star, or a seasonal marker, or a mythologically important figure? What if it is being recorded because something was there, near those stars, or appearing to come from near those stars, on a specific night between 11,000 and 12,000 years ago? Something that the people who built this site witnessed and considered important enough to mark permanently. I want to be clear, I am not proposing anything. I am noting the logical space. But the logical space is there, and I cannot unsee it. Part 5. The Carvings. The astronomical correspondence was the headline of Dr. Mayer's paper. The carvings on the stones were the footnote. In retrospect, this may have been the wrong priority, not because the astronomical correspondence is not extraordinary, but because the carvings are the part of the Naru Tash site that in the years since has begun to connect to things far beyond the Ustjort Plateau. The carvings appear on the upper surface of 7 of the 17 slabs, the 7 that have not been completely buried by the millennia of wind-blown sediment that has partially engulfed the site. On the buried slabs, the carvings may also exist. There is no way to know without excavation, and the site has not been formally excavated. The 7 visible carved slabs each carry markings that share certain consistent elements while varying in their specifics. The consistent elements are A series of nested arcs, curves inside curves, like a cross-section of a nautilus shell, but without the regularity of the nautilus. The arcs are asymmetrical. The spacing between them is not consistent, varying in ways that suggest either imprecision, unlikely given the evident care of the other elements, or intentional modulation, a code, in other words, in which the spacing is the message. Along the outer arcs, small vertical marks at intervals that appear consistent across all 7 slabs. The marks are small, perhaps 2 centimeters tall in the original stone, but clearly deliberate. They are too regular to be accidental and too small to be primarily decorative. They look like counting marks, or like measurements, or like the marks on a ruler, though a ruler measuring something that does not correspond to any unit of measurement in any known system. At certain points on each slab, different points on each slab, never in the same position relative to the arcs, a symbol that appears in varied orientations but consistent form. This is the symbol that Dr. Mayer's paper describes as unknown, possibly related to abstract astronomical representation, and that subsequent researchers working independently have described differently, as a stylized hand with 6 or 7 fingers, as a sun with rays that bend rather than radiating straight, as an eye with extended lashes, as a flower with bilateral asymmetry, as a wave pattern in the moment of breaking. No 2 descriptions of the symbol are entirely the same. This may be because people perceive it differently, or it may be because the symbol is designed to be read differently depending on the orientation in which it is encountered, a symbol whose meaning shifts with context, as many ancient symbols do. What does the symbol mean? I cannot tell you. Nobody can tell you with any confidence. What I can tell you is where else it appears. It appears in a cave system in the Cantabrian mountains of northern Spain, among a cluster of engravings that have been dated to approximately 14,000 years before the present. It appears on a fragment of fired clay excavated from a settlement site in the upper Tigris River valley of what is now southeastern Turkey, dated to approximately 9,000 years before the present. It appears in a form that is clearly related, though not identical, carved into a rock face in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, a site that has not been formally dated, but that is surrounded by other engravings consistent with a very great age. It appears, most recently discovered, on the base of a monolithic stone figure at a site in the Ethiopian highlands that we will visit later in this account. These 5 occurrences are separated by distances ranging from 5 to 12,000 kilometers. They are separated by time periods ranging from 2,000 to 5,000 years. The cultures that produced them had, by any conventional archaeological assessment, no contact with one another. The symbol persisted anyway. Movement 3. The World Beneath the World. Part 1. On What Lies Below. There is something primordially significant to the human mind about descent. Every mythology in the world has a version of it. The journey downward, into the earth, into the dark, into the place beneath the place where ordinary life is lived. In Greek myth, Orpheus descends to recover what he has lost. In Sumerian myth, Inanna descends and is stripped of every protection she possesses, layer by layer, until she arrives at the center with nothing. In the myths of the Norse, the roots of the world tree reach down into 3 realms beneath the surface, and at the deepest root sits the well of memory, tended by a being who has been there since before the world had its current shape. The pattern is consistent. Descent is the path to knowledge. Not ordinary knowledge, not the practical knowledge of how to plant and harvest, how to navigate by stars, how to build a shelter. The knowledge that requires descent is older and stranger than that. It is the knowledge of origins, the knowledge of what was before, the knowledge that cannot be reached from the surface because the surface is too new. I have been underground many times in the course of this work. I have walked through cave systems in France and Spain that contain the oldest confirmed human artwork on Earth. Paintings made 30 to 40,000 years ago by people whose names we will never know and whose languages we cannot reconstruct. I have descended into burial chambers in Ireland that were positioned with such precision that the sunrise on the winter solstice sends a beam of light down a 20-meter passage to illuminate a carved stone at the exact back of the chamber, a feat of astronomical engineering so sophisticated that it was performed 5,000 years ago, before the invention of the instruments we would use to replicate it today. I have been in the underground, and I have felt in all of these places the second kind of silence, the silence that has weight, the silence that holds something. But in none of these well-documented and extensively studied places have I felt what I felt in the place I am about to describe. Because the well-documented places, whatever their mysteries, exist within a framework of human understanding. We know, more or less, who made them and why and when. The mystery is in the details, not in the fact of the thing. The place I am about to describe exists outside any framework I know how to apply. It exists in the space where the framework ends and the question begins. Part 2. The Passage at Harat Dib. The Wadi Rum region of southern Jordan is, to anyone who has been there, one of the most otherworldly landscapes on Earth's surface. The terrain is a collision between enormous sandstone and granite massifs, mountains that rise abruptly from a flat, sandy floor, their faces striated in bands of red and ochre and pale gold that record hundreds of millions of years of geological deposition in visible layers. The floor between the mountains is smooth and vast and silent in the particular way of deserts, a silence that is not emptiness, but fullness, the fullness of space that human presence has not saturated. The Bedouin communities that have lived in and around Wadi Rum for centuries, and whose ancestors lived there for millennia before that, know the landscape as intimately as any people know any place. They know which canyons hold water after rain and which do not. They know which rock faces carry ancient carvings and which were carved more recently. They know which places feel different from other places, and in a landscape as charged as Wadi Rum, there are many such places. They knew about the entrance in the canyon wall. The canyon in question is a narrow slot between two massive sandstone formations, approximately 14 kilometers from the nearest paved road, and accessible only on foot or by camel. The Bedouin name for the canyon translates roughly as the throat, not because it is dangerous, though it is narrow enough to feel constricting, but because of the quality of sound within it. Sounds made in the canyon, a footstep, a cough, a voice, reverberate in ways that suggest the canyon's geometry is not quite what it appears. The sound does not behave as it should in a simple slot between two rock faces. There are harmonics, unexpected resonances, as though the sound is bouncing off surfaces that are not visible. This may be because some of those surfaces are not visible, because they are behind the canyon wall, in the passage that opens behind the fall of loose rock near the canyon's far end. The entrance is small, approximately 1 meter high and half a meter wide when the concealing rock is moved, and was discovered, as I described earlier, in 1931 by a Bedouin shepherd who chose not to explore it and chose not to speak of it for more than a decade. His reticence was not unusual. There are places in the desert that the Bedouin do not enter, not because of formal prohibition, not because of any specific fear, but because of a collective understanding that has accumulated over generations. Certain places are not for people. Or, more precisely, certain places are not for people now. They were for people before, for the people before people, and they will be for people again, eventually, when the people are ready. In the meantime, you leave them alone. This is not superstition exactly. It is more like a form of respect for something whose nature you cannot fully specify, but whose significance you can clearly sense. The British military surveyor who entered the passage in 1942, his name was Captain James Alderton, and his survey notes are in the collection of the British Library's Archive of Middle Eastern Military Surveys, which is where a researcher eventually found them in 1994. Was not operating under any such respect. He was a practical man on a practical mission, and the unusual opening in the canyon wall was a navigational curiosity that deserved a note. He moved the rock, descended with a torch, and walked to the bottom. He spent approximately 45 minutes underground by his own account, an estimate he gave when he described the visit verbally to a colleague at a mess dinner sometime in 1943. The account in his survey notes is shorter than the verbal account, but it includes the sketches I described earlier, the descending corridor, the carvings on the walls, the chamber at the bottom with its elevated central stone. What he said verbally that he did not write in the survey notes was this: there were carvings everywhere, not just on the walls, on the ceiling too in places. Whatever they meant, there was a tremendous amount of it. And at the bottom, in the main chamber, the stone in the center, it wasn't just a flat stone with a design on it. It was the size of a large table, perfectly level, elevated on 4 smaller stones at the corners. And the design on its surface, I'm not an artistic person, Humphrey. I won't pretend to understand what I was looking at, but it looked like a map of something. Not a map of the canyon, not a map of the desert, a map of something much larger, something I couldn't identify. He paused, according to the colleague's later memoir, and then added, the chamber was cold, not cool, cold, like a wine cellar, but deeper. I couldn't account for it, and there was a sound, very low, very quiet, not quite a hum, not quite a tone, something between the two. I tried to find its source and couldn't. I decided to leave. He returned to the surface and noted the coordinates in his survey log. He intended to return after the war. He did not return. The war ended, his service ended, he returned to England and resumed a civilian life, and the Wadi Rum site receded into the category of things that had been interesting once, at a specific moment, and that life had since moved him beyond. He died in 1978 in Exeter. His survey notes went to the British Library. The verbal account of his underground visit survived in his colleague's memoir, published privately in 1981 in a print run of 200 copies. Part 3. Rania. In the autumn of 1997, a doctoral candidate at the University of Jordan named Rania Al-Masri was deep in the research phase of her dissertation on pre-Nabatean rock art in the Wadi Rum region when she came across the British Library catalogue entry for Alderton's survey notes. She was in London for a conference, and the archive was a short tube journey from her conference hotel. She spent an afternoon reading the notes and made careful copies of the sketches. She recognized the carvings immediately, not as anything she could identify, but as something clearly significant, clearly ancient, clearly not belonging to any of the known rock art traditions of the region. She recognized the style as different from anything she had seen in 4 years of fieldwork in Wadi Rum, different in its complexity, different in its density, different in a quality she described to her dissertation supervisor as intention. The Wadi Rum rock art she had been studying was expressive, figures of humans and animals and abstract forms made by people communicating something about their world. The carvings in Alderton's sketches were not expressive in that way. They were systematic, they were organized, they had the quality, as she put it, of writing rather than drawing, even though they did not resemble any known script. She spent the winter of 1997-1998 attempting to locate the site, using Alderton's coordinates and his geographical descriptions. The coordinates, translated from the British military grid system, placed the site within an area of approximately 50 square kilometers of Wadi Rum. This was manageable. She knew the terrain. She found the canyon in February of 1998. The entrance was still partially concealed by the fall of rock, but someone, she did not know who, could not determine when, had moved the concealing stones to one side at some point after Alderton's visit. The opening was exposed. Someone had been there. She entered alone. She had told her supervisor she was conducting a standard rock art survey in the area, which was true in that she had survey equipment. She had not told him about Harat Deeb. She was underground for 2 days. She emerged on the morning of the 3rd day. The research assistant, who had been waiting at the vehicles, rowing increasingly concerned, described her as physically unharmed, but altered in some way that he found difficult to specify precisely. She moved differently, he said. She was quiet in a way she had not been before. She declined food and water initially, then accepted both without comment. She sat in the back of the vehicle for the drive back to Aqaba and did not speak for several hours. Over the following weeks, she developed her photographs. She had brought a film camera, and her notes indicated that she had shot approximately 12 rolls of 36 exposure film and filled the notebook she had brought with detailed sketches and written observations. Her research assistant saw portions of these, enough to tell me many years later that they were extraordinary, densely detailed, systematic in a way that suggested she had been working with great concentration and great care. She did not publish. In March of 1998, she attended an archaeological conference in Amman, where in the informal conversation around a session on pre-Islamic rock art, she spoke briefly with a Jordanian archaeologist named Dr. Faris Khalidi about what she had found. Dr. Khalidi, to his credit, took notes. His notes were later published as an appendix to his 2009 memoir of his career in Jordanian archaeology, under the heading, "A Conversation I Have Thought About Often." The relevant portion of his notes reads, R.A.M. Rania al-Masri described a subterranean chamber system of considerable extent. She estimated at least 15 meters diameter for the main chamber, though she acknowledged her measurements were informal. She said the walls of the passage and chamber were covered entirely in carved script. She was careful to use the word script rather than carvings or petroglyphs. She said it was clearly a writing system, systematic, consistent, with recurring elements that suggested grammar and syntax rather than random decoration. She said it corresponded to no known script she had encountered in her research, which, given her expertise in pre-Islamic Arabian epigraphy, was a significant statement. She described a central stone in the main chamber, elevated, flat, large, covered in what she called a stellar diagram. I pressed her on this. She said it was a map of stars, but not a map of any stellar configuration she could identify. She said it appeared to show stars in relationships to each other that she did not recognize from any star map she had consulted. She mentioned that some of the stellar bodies in the diagram appeared to have trajectories marked, paths through the sky, arcing from one point to another. She said, "It is not a map of where the stars are, it is a map of where something was going." I asked about the age of the site. She said she could not date it from visual inspection. Dating carved stone without material samples is essentially impossible. But she said the degree of mineral deposition on the carved surfaces, the way certain weathering products had accumulated in the carved grooves over time, suggested to her that the site was very old. She said not hundreds of years, thousands, many thousands. She was reluctant to be more specific. At this point in our conversation, she stopped. She sat quietly for a moment, and then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "There was also a symbol in the upper part of the main chamber, carved larger than the others. I recognized it. I do not know from where. I recognized it the way you recognize a word in a foreign language that you have heard once, a long time ago, and that you cannot place. You know you have encountered it before, but the memory of the encounter has no context. I kept looking at the symbol and feeling that it should mean something to me, not something I had been taught, something I already knew." Dr. Khalidi's note continues. She withdrew from her doctoral program the following month. I have not seen her since. I have sometimes wondered whether the correct response to that conversation was to do nothing, which is what I did. I am still not certain. Rania al-Masri is, as far as I have been able to determine, alive and well. She works in an unrelated field. She did not respond to the requests for comment I sent through mutual contacts. I respect her decision. The account here is reconstructed from Dr. Khalidi's published notes, her former research assistant's recollections, and a brief passage in her supervisor's published recollections of her as a student, a passage in which he notes, with the gentle puzzlement of a man who never understood quite what happened, that she had been his most promising student and that her departure from the program had been a loss for the field. The photographs she developed, the notebook she filled underground, their location is unknown. Part 4. What the Underground Remembers. I have spent a significant amount of time trying to understand why people built underground. The obvious answers, shelter from weather, defense against enemies, storage for food and water, account for much of the underground architecture in human history. Cisterns, cellars, escape tunnels, storage chambers. These are the practical undergrounds, and they are found in every culture and every era, because they serve needs that every culture and every era shares. But there is another category of underground architecture found across the world and across time that is not practical in any of these ways. It is too deep, too elaborate, too difficult to access, too carefully carved, and too deliberately placed to serve any of the practical functions of underground space. It is underground for a different reason. The question is, what reason? The Cappadocian underground cities of central Turkey, Derinkuyu, Kaymakli, Ozkonak, and others, are the most dramatic example most people know. Cities carved from volcanic rock, descending many levels below the surface, capable of housing tens of thousands of people, along with their livestock and supplies. The accepted explanation is that they served as refuges during periods of invasion, which is certainly true for the Christian communities that used them in the Byzantine period. But the geological and archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest levels of these cities are significantly older than the Byzantine period. Some researchers believe the deepest levels were begun during the Late Bronze Age or earlier. A small number of researchers, working from geological weathering evidence, have proposed dates significantly earlier still, dates that the mainstream prefers not to engage with because they would require a very different understanding of who built them and why. The Maltese hypogeum of Hal Saflieni is better documented and more carefully studied, an elaborate underground complex on the Mediterranean island of Malta, carved from limestone, consisting of interconnected chambers over 3 levels. Its oldest portions dated to approximately 5,000 years before the present. The hypogeum appears to have served both as a place of burial and as a place of ritual or ceremony. Its acoustics are extraordinary. Certain chambers produce resonances at specific frequencies that appear to have been deliberately engineered. The shape of the chambers and the placement of their openings, creating a system that amplifies particular sound frequencies while dampening others. The frequency most powerfully amplified, approximately 110 Hz, has been identified by researchers studying the neuroscience of sound as the frequency at which human brainwave patterns most readily shift from ordinary waking consciousness toward the patterns associated with deep meditative or trance states. Someone, 5,000 years ago, carved a space specifically designed to alter the consciousness of people who entered it. This is not speculation. This is the measurement of the space and the neurological research and the straightforward observation that these two things correspond in a way that could not be accidental. The underground was a technology of consciousness. That is the conclusion I keep returning to, no matter how many different paths I approach it from. The underground was built in case after case, culture after culture, era after era, as a tool for accessing states of mind that ordinary surface life did not provide, states in which something could be known or experienced or received that the busy light of the surface world drowned out. What was being received? In the Harat Dib chamber, according to Captain Alderton, there was a sound, low, continuous, sourceless, not quite a hum, not quite a tone, something between the two. The planet Earth produces infrasound, very low-frequency acoustic waves through a variety of processes: wind patterns, ocean currents, volcanic activity, the movement of tectonic plates. Most of these frequencies are far below the threshold of human hearing. They are felt rather than heard, a sense of presence, of pressure, of something nearby that cannot be seen. Animals are sensitive to infrasound in ways that humans largely are not, which may explain why certain animals behave unusually near certain geological formations, near certain underground chambers, near certain places that humans have, over centuries, learned to treat with a particular kind of deference. The horses that refuse the Naru Tash complex, the livestock that Bedouin herders have learned over generations to route away from the canyon that contains the entrance to Harat Dib. There are specific geological conditions that produce infrasound in underground chambers at frequencies that human beings can detect not as sound, but as sensation, as an altered state, a feeling of significance, a sense that the space is occupied by something that cannot be seen. These conditions are not rare. They occur wherever certain combinations of rock formation and underground geometry intersect in specific ways. The people who built the underground chambers may have found these locations precisely because of this quality, because the place itself, before any carving was done, was already producing an effect. They may have built there not to create the effect, but to mark it, to formalize it, to make it reliably accessible. The carvings are not decoration, they are directions for how to receive what the place is already transmitting. Movement 4. The Myth That Crosses Oceans. Part 1. The Grammar of a Story That Should Not Exist. Stories travel. This is one of the foundational principles of comparative mythology, and it is well documented and non-controversial. Trade routes and migration patterns carry stories across large distances, and when two cultures share a myth, the most parsimonious explanation is usually that one culture inherited it from the other, or that both inherited it from a common ancestor culture that is now gone. The principle is sound. It has explained a great many mythological correspondences that initially seemed mysterious. The widespread flood myth, the story of a great deluge that destroys the world and from which a small group of survivors preserves the continuity of life, was long considered one of the deepest mysteries of comparative mythology, its appearance in so many different cultures seemingly impossible to explain by simple cultural transmission. Then the geology was understood better, and the archaeology was understood better, and it became clear that catastrophic flooding events, from the filling of the Black Sea basin to the rapid coastal flooding associated with the end of the last ice age, were real events that affected many different human populations at different times and in different places, and the flood myth, rather than being a single transmitted story, began to look more like a category of story that many different cultures developed independently, because many different cultures had experienced something that warranted recording. This is the sensible approach. Start with the mundane explanation, prefer cultural transmission over independent invention, prefer independent invention in response to real events over something more exotic. But there is a category of mythological correspondence that resists this approach, that does not resolve into transmission routes or shared experiences, no matter how carefully you trace the historical record. A category of correspondence in which the details are too specific, too consistent, too structurally complex to be explained by independent development in response to shared human experiences, and for which no plausible transmission route exists. The myth I am about to describe is in that category. Part 2. The People Before People. A Myth in 5 Voices. I want to present this myth carefully because its force lies in the accumulation of detail, in the specific ways in which traditions that could not have communicated with each other describe the same thing in the same terms. So I will give you each tradition in turn and ask you to carry them all simultaneously and see what shape they form. Voice 1. The Sengilen, as told by the Evenki. The Evenki are a Tungusic people of northern Siberia, spread across an enormous territory from the Yenisei River in the west to the Pacific coast in the east, a territory so vast that different Evenki communities, separated by distances of thousands of kilometers, have developed distinct dialects and distinct traditions while retaining a shared cultural and linguistic core. The tradition I'm describing here comes from a specific community in the Irkutsk region of eastern Siberia and was recorded in detail by the Russian ethnographer Alexei Polikarpov between 1919 and 1923. Polikarpov's field notebooks are held in the archives of the Russian Museum of Ethnography in St. Petersburg. They have been partially published in Russian in a 1961 academic collection of Siberian ethnographic materials. They have not, to my knowledge, been translated into English in their entirety. The Evenki tradition, as recorded by Polikarpov, describes beings called the Sengilen, a word that does not translate simply, as it carries multiple layers of meaning simultaneously. Those who came first, and also those who knew more, and also in a third register of meaning that Polikarpov struggled to render in Russian, something like those who carried the shape of things. The Sengilen are not gods in the Evenki cosmological framework. They are not worshipped, do not control natural forces, do not intercede in human affairs. They are prior. They existed before the present order of the world was established, and their existence belongs to a stratum of time that even the Evenki origin mythology treats as beyond ordinary historical reckoning. The Sengilen were, the tradition says, builders, not of structures. The tradition is explicit that they did not build in the way that people build, enclosing space and roofing it against weather. They built in the landscape itself, arrangements, patterns, inscriptions. They carved into stone, the tradition says, the shape of what they knew. This phrase, the shape of what they knew, is repeated across multiple versions of the story that Polikarpov recorded from different elders, with enough consistency to suggest it is a formalized expression rather than a spontaneous description. The Sengilen carved the shape of what they knew into stone because they understood that stone was the most durable medium available, and they needed what they knew to be preserved across a duration of time longer than memory could carry. Why? Why did they need to preserve it? The tradition answers this because they were leaving, not dying, not being destroyed by catastrophe, or conquered by stronger forces, leaving. The Sengilen departed the world, the tradition says, because they understood that the world was entering a new phase, a new era, and the era that was beginning was not for them. It was for a different kind of being, for people. The relationship between the Sengilen and the people who came after them is described in Polikarpov's notes with a particular care. The elder who was the primary source for the tradition, an old woman named Agdasi, whom Polikarpov describes as approximately 80 years old and as the keeper of the community's ceremonial knowledge, was at pains to clarify something that she clearly felt was frequently misunderstood. The Sengilen were not human, but they were not opposed to humans, not hostile to them, not superior to them in any moral sense. They were simply different. They had come from a different place and knew different things and operated by different means. Their presence in the world during the era that preceded people was purposeful. They were here to do something, and when they had done it, when the carvings were complete, when the patterns were set, when the shape of what they knew was recorded in stone in all the places it needed to be recorded, they left. Polikarpov recorded the question he asked Agdasi. Where did they go? Her answer, which he reproduced phonetically in Evenki before translating, was this: They went to where they came from, but the way there is not in the ground or in the sky. It is in the space between the ground and the sky, in the air that does not move, at the height where even eagles do not fly. Polikarpov noted parenthetically, she indicates with her hands a height above the mountains. He then asked, and what happens when people find the carvings? What are they supposed to do with them? Agdasi was quiet for a long time before answering. Then she said, understand them, that is all. just understand them. The Sengilin did not leave instructions for action. They left instructions for understanding. When we understand, the next thing will happen by itself. Polikarpov asked, "What next thing?" She shook her head. She would not say. Voice 2. The Makers, as understood by the Muda of the Nepal highlands. The Muda are a small ethnic group living in a remote area of central Nepal, in the highlands between the major river valleys, in terrain so difficult of access that they remained essentially unstudied by outsiders until the 1960s. Their language, which linguists have classified as a highly divergent branch of the Tibeto-Burman family, but which some researchers have argued may represent an older linguistic layer than any currently recognized Tibeto-Burman language, was first documented by the German linguist Dr. Franz Windeborn, who spent 3 years in their villages between 1971 and 1974, and produced a grammar, a partial dictionary, and a collection of oral texts. The oral texts include the tradition that Windeborn called in his cataloging the teaching before the teaching, a phrase that appears in the tradition itself in a formulaic opening that Windeborn found used consistently across different tellings. The formula translates approximately as, "Before our people came to the mountains were being inscribed. This is what was being inscribed, and this is why, and this is what happened to the inscribers, and this is what we have forgotten and must one day remember." The beings who inscribed the mountains, who carved into every available stone surface in the highland terrain, are called in Muda by a word that Windeborn translates as the Makers, though he notes that the word's root is more complex than this translation captures. It combines meanings associated with craft, with memory, and with a concept that has no direct English equivalent, something like the intentional preservation of form. The Makers in the Muda tradition were engaged in a task of great urgency. They were carving because they had been told, the tradition does not specify by whom, that they would not remain in the world long enough to transmit what they knew through living speech. They were running, the tradition says, against a kind of time that the Muda language describes with a specific word, tharmung, which Windeborn translates as time that ends a kind of being, the closing of an era, the termination not of individual lives, but of a whole category of existence. They carved day and night, the tradition says. They carved in the mountain faces, in the cave walls, in the flat surfaces of river boulders, in the elevated plateaus. They carved with instruments that the Muda tradition does not describe in any specific way, only with the general statement that the carvings were made by means beyond ordinary human capacity, which Windeborn diplomatically footnotes as possibly a ritual rationalization of the evident skill and scale of the work. The carvings were organized. This is a central point of the tradition, one that Windeborn found repeated in every version he recorded. They were not random expressions. They constituted a single text, distributed across many surfaces, structured in a sequence that a sufficiently skilled reader could follow from one stone to the next, as one follows words across the page of a book. The sequence had a beginning, marked by a specific symbol that told the reader this is where the text starts, and an end, though the Muda tradition does not describe what the end looked like, perhaps because the last sections of the text were the last to be carved and were completed only as the makers were departing. When the Muda ancestors arrived in the highlands, the tradition says, they found the carvings everywhere. The first generation could read them. This is stated directly, without elaboration, as though it requires no explanation. The first Muda understood the text. They knew what it said. But they did not write it down, because writing was not yet a practice among them, and they assumed they would always be able to read the stone. Generations passed. The stone remained. The ability to read it did not. By the time Wendeborn recorded the tradition in the 1970s, nobody in the Muda community could read the carvings. The tradition preserved the fact of their existence and their importance, and the general nature of their content. Instructions, the tradition consistently called them, instructions for something that would one day need to be done, but not the instructions themselves. Wendeborn asked in multiple interviews whether anyone knew what the first symbol in the sequence looked like. The beginning marker, the sign that said, "This is where the text starts." One elder, a woman named Pema Yangzom, who was the community's primary keeper of oral tradition, answered. She drew the symbol in the dirt with a stick. It was a spiral that transformed at its center into something that could be read as an eye, a vortex opening into a gaze. Wendeborn, who had no knowledge of Harat Dib, made a careful copy of the drawing in his fieldwork notebook and labeled it Opening Symbol, possibly astronomical. Cf. Spiral Motifs in Tibetan Religious Art. It is symbol 14. The departed ones, as remembered by the Bunurong of southeastern Australia. The Bunurong people are the traditional custodians of a coastal region of southeastern Australia, along what is now the Port Phillip Bay and the western coast of the Mornington Peninsula in the state of Victoria. Their country is a landscape of extraordinary beauty, shallow bays, coastal cliffs, river estuaries, the dense scrub of the coastal hinterland. It is also a landscape of extraordinary age. The Bunurong people have been on their country for a very long time, and their knowledge of its past, its geological transformations, its ecological changes, its long human history, is embedded in their oral tradition in ways that are only now beginning to be systematically studied. The information I am drawing on here comes from a specific project conducted between 2004 and 2009 by a collaborative research team, including Bunurong community members and academic researchers from the University of Melbourne, which produced a large volume of oral tradition material as part of a cultural documentation initiative. This material is held in community-controlled archives and is only partially available to outside researchers. The sections I am drawing on were shared in summary form in a 2011 academic paper on Aboriginal oral traditions as geological records, and were further elaborated in a public lecture given in 2014 by a Bunurong community elder and cultural knowledge keeper, Dr. Carol Davison, who holds a doctorate in Indigenous Australian Studies and who has spoken publicly about these specific traditions with the community's authorization. In Bunurong cosmological understanding, the dreaming, Bunjildwarna, is the foundational time, the creative era, the period in which the world and its inhabitants and the laws governing their relationship were established. The dreaming is not past in the ordinary sense. It is simultaneously origin and ongoing ground of reality, accessible through ceremony, story, and relationship with country. What is less widely known, and what Dr. Davison has spoken about specifically in the context of the collaborative research project, is that the Bunurong tradition holds a layer of understanding that precedes the dreaming, a period that is not dreaming, that the dreaming itself came after, a period that the tradition refers to as Baluk Nginlingala, which Dr. Davison translates as the time of the ones who were before the being of things. This translation is acknowledged to be imprecise. The Bunurong language does not map cleanly onto English conceptual categories, and the phrase contains within it a set of distinctions that English struggles to render. But the gist, as Dr. Davison explained in her 2014 lecture, is this: before the dreaming, there was something else. Not nothing, not a void or an absence, something else. A kind of existence that was prior to the existence the dreaming established. And in that prior existence, there were beings, not creator beings, not the figures who established the laws of the dreaming, but beings who were already here when the world was taking its current shape, who witnessed the transition from the prior existence to the dreaming era, and who then departed. They departed from specific places on the country. These departure points are known to the Bunurong community, and they are treated with particular care, not with fear, but with a very deliberate kind of respect. They are not ceremony sites in the ordinary sense. They are, as Dr. Davison put it, places where the membrane is different, where the boundary between the dreaming and what came before the dreaming is thinner than elsewhere. At some of these sites, there are markings, rock carvings mostly, petroglyphs in the coastal sandstone that are, Dr. Davison said carefully, not the same kind as the other carvings in our country. She did not elaborate further on this point in the public lecture, but in correspondence with one of the academic researchers from the collaborative project, correspondence that the researcher shared with me with community permission, she wrote, "The carvings at the departure places are not traditional in our sense. They are older than our tradition. Our tradition acknowledges their presence and their importance, but it does not claim them as Bunurong work. They were made by the ones who were here before. The dreaming does not tell us what they mean. It tells us to leave them alone and to remember that they matter. What they say is not for us yet. It is for the future people, the people who will come when the time is right to read them." She added, "We have one sign that tells us which carvings belong to this category, which ones are from the departure places rather than from our own tradition. It is a specific mark, always present. When you see it, you know. I will not describe it in writing, but it would not be unfamiliar to someone who has looked carefully. I believe I know which mark she means. The stone writers, as encoded in the tradition of the Chimane of Bolivia. The Chimane are an indigenous people of the Bolivian Amazon, living along the Manique and Apure rivers in the Beni department, a region of lowland tropical forest that was, until the mid-20th century, almost completely inaccessible to outsiders. Their language is a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family, which suggests a very long period of separation from other linguistic groups, consistent with the great antiquity of their presence in their territory. Their oral tradition includes a category of stories designated as Manique Yije, the stories from the bottom of time. These stories are marked as different from other narrative categories in Chimane oral tradition. They are told only in specific contexts by specific authorized tellers, and they carry a weight that other stories do not. They are not entertainment. They are not teaching stories in the practical sense. They do not explain how to hunt or which plants to eat or how to treat illness. They are, as a Chimane cultural consultant described to an anthropologist studying the tradition in the 1980s, the stories that tell us what we are inside history. One of the Manique Yije stories describes beings the Chimane call the Yushinbo, the stone writers. They were not gods. They did not control the rain or the river or the forest. They were, the story says, workers, beings whose function was to preserve something, to protect a form of knowledge from the forgetting that time causes. They worked in stone because stone lasts. They worked in patterns because patterns carry information more densely and more durably than pictures. And they worked in every place they could reach because they did not know which places would survive and which would be destroyed by the changes that were coming. They knew the changes were coming. This is a central element of the Chimane tradition. The stone writers knew that the world was about to transform, not in a catastrophic sense, not fire or flood, but in a quieter and more profound way. The structure of reality was about to shift. Something that had been true about the world was about to become less true, or true differently, and what replaced it would be the world that people, the people who came after, would live in. The world we live in now. The Yushinbo finished their work just before this transformation occurred. The stories are clear on this. They finished, and then they were gone, and then the world changed. The sequence is always the same. The Chimane people did not find the stone writers' carvings exactly, or rather, they found them gradually over the long course of their presence in the forest, and incorporated them into their understanding of their territory without making them central to their ritual practice. They are noted, treated respectfully, left undisturbed. What they say is not fully known, but the tradition notes one thing, that the stone writers always marked the beginning of a text with a specific sign, a sign that said, "Here is where you begin reading." The anthropologist who studied the Manique Jidye tradition in the 1980s, Dr. Maria Colarossi, asked whether this beginning sign could be described. Her consultant, a man named Chinto, who was one of the authorized tellers of the stories, considered for a moment and then made a gesture in the air with his hand, a spiral pulling inward that became at its center a kind of opening, a point of convergence. Dr. Colarossi made a note. Gesture suggests a spiral converging to a central point, possibly astronomical, black hole, or galaxy, or symbolic of interior consciousness, unable to determine. Voice 5. The predecessors in the barely spoken tradition of the Twa of the Central African forest. The Twa, sometimes called Batwa, though terminology varies by region and is contested, are the indigenous forest-dwelling people of the Great Lakes region of Central Africa, one of the oldest populations in Africa, and possibly among the oldest continuously existing human populations on Earth. Genetic studies have found that certain Twa lineages carry markers suggesting their ancestors separated from other human populations at an extremely early date, early enough that some researchers have described them as representing one of the deepest branches of the modern human family tree. Their oral tradition is among the least studied of any surviving oral tradition in the world, partly because of historical marginalization, and partly because access to their communities requires a level of sustained relationship building that few researchers have achieved. What is known comes from a very small number of studies, none of them comprehensive, and from the testimony of researchers who have worked with specific Twa communities for specific purposes over limited periods. A Belgian anthropologist named Edouard Masson spent 18 months with a Twa community in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo in the late 1950s, working on a broader study of forest-dwelling cultures of the region. His primary publications concerned food practices and kinship systems, but in a monograph published very late in his career, 1991, when he was nearly 80, he wrote about what he called the peripheral tradition of the community he had lived with, the stories that existed at the edges of the community's acknowledged narrative culture, the stories that were not secret but that were not formally transmitted either, that were simply there, part of the ambient knowledge of the community, told in moments of low formality and then not discussed. One of these peripheral stories was about beings who had lived in the forest, or rather in the world, before people. They were called, in the Twa language that Masson imperfectly recorded, by a term he translates as the first ones who remained. The name suggests that they were the survivors of something, that other beings had preceded them, and these were the ones who had stayed when the others left. They did not build in this tradition, they inscribed. They marked the trees and the rocks and the earth itself with signs. The trees are long gone, and the earth's surface changes, but the rocks remain, and on certain rocks in certain parts of the forest, Masson's sources told him, the marks of the first ones who remained can still be seen. Masson never found these rocks. He was directed toward them on 2 occasions, but the community members who were leading him consistently stopped before reaching the site and declined to go further. He eventually understood that there was no prohibition on his seeing the site, only a collective reluctance to be present there. As one of his companions explained, using language that Masson recorded and translated with evident care, "It is a place that feels like looking at something too large. It is not harmful, it is just more than we need. We have lived in this forest for all the time that has been, and we have learned that some things are large in ways that we do not need to understand every day. We respect them. We do not live next to them." Masson asked whether the signs on the rocks could be described. His companion said slowly, "They begin with one sign that is like a path going inward, like a river that spirals and goes down instead of down the slope." Part 3. What 5 traditions know. Let me assemble what we have. 5 oral traditions from 5 cultures with no contact and no plausible transmission route, each describing beings who existed in the world before the world took its current form, beings who built or inscribed or carved in stone at great scale and with great urgency because they knew they were leaving, beings who were not gods, not spirits, not ancestors in the conventional sense, but something between or outside these categories, something that the languages of each tradition strain to name. Beings who left something behind, not possessions, not territory, not offspring, but knowledge, encoded in stone, distributed across the landscape of the world. And in each tradition, the encoded knowledge is marked with a specific symbol, a beginning symbol, the sign that says, "Here is where you start reading." In the Muda tradition, that symbol is drawn by an elder as a spiral becoming an eye. In the Tsine tradition, it is gestured by a storyteller as a spiral converging to a point of opening. In the Twa tradition, it is described as a path going inward, like a river that spirals and goes down. In the Bunurong tradition, it is described as a specific mark whose physical description is withheld from public documentation, but which a researcher who has worked with the community for years describes as something that would not be unfamiliar to someone who has looked carefully. Movement 5. The Travelers Who Did Not Return. Part 1. On the Pattern of Disappearance. Every field has its cautionary figures, the researchers who pushed too far, who lost perspective, who allowed their fascination to overcome their judgment and ended careers in disgrace or obscurity or silence. Every field also has its romanticized versions of these figures, the tragic geniuses whose work was too ahead of its time, too threatening to established orthodoxy, too inconvenient for the institutional powers that shape what is and is not acceptable to investigate. I am not, in what follows, attempting to romanticize anyone. I am not proposing that any of the people I am about to describe were victims of conspiracy, or were deliberately silenced, or were taken by supernatural forces. I am describing a pattern, and patterns require attention regardless of how they make us feel about the conclusions they might imply. The pattern is this: a disproportionate number of the researchers, explorers, monks, and independent scholars who have investigated specific sites that fall within the network of sites I am examining in this documentary have ended their investigations abruptly and without clear explanation. Some died, some disappeared, some simply withdrew from their projects, from their professional lives, from the intellectual community that had been their context, and became unreachable. The proportion is not so dramatic as to suggest agency. It is not as though every investigator of these sites meets a mysterious end. Most do not. Most complete their work, publish or do not publish, and continue their lives. But the proportion of abrupt endings is higher than one would expect from chance, and the quality of the endings, the way they happen, the timing, the circumstances, shares certain characteristics across many cases. Part 2. Father Tomás Echevarría. Father Tomás Echevarría was a Jesuit priest and scholar who spent most of his professional life in the late 19th and early 20th century in the Bolivian highlands, working in indigenous communities in the Altiplano and the valleys of the eastern Andes. He was a careful linguist who made significant contributions to the documentation of indigenous Bolivian languages, and he was also a careful observer of indigenous oral tradition, with a researcher's instinct for distinguishing between ceremonial performance and the transmission of genuinely old knowledge. He is not well known today, even within the relatively small field of Bolivian indigenous studies, partly because his major work was never completed, and partly because the circumstances of his later life were sufficiently unusual that his reputation became associated with a kind of cautionary narrative that the scholarly community preferred not to amplify. He spent 11 years, between 1901 and 1912, investigating what he called, in the private letters that constitute the primary record of his later research, the underground road. He was not speaking literally, or not entirely literally. He was describing a network of sites in the Bolivian and Peruvian Andes, caves, carved rock faces, underground chambers, and a number of monolithic stone structures that he believed were connected. Not physically connected, not necessarily contemporaneous, but connected in the sense that they shared characteristics that suggested a common origin or a common purpose. He was, in other words, tracing the same network that I am tracing 100 years later, through different methodology and from a different starting point. His letters, addressed mostly to a Jesuit colleague at the Universidad Complutense in Madrid, document his progress through this investigation with a quality of escalating excitement that is both admirable and, in retrospect, concerning. The early letters are methodical, analytical, the letters of a scholar who has found an interesting problem and is approaching it with appropriate rigor. By the middle period, around 1907 and 1908, the letters have changed. The methodology is still present, the observations are still careful, but there is an undertone of something else, an urgency, an awareness that what he was approaching was larger than he had initially estimated. In a letter dated March of 1908, writing from a village in the Bolivian province of Inquisivi, where he had been investigating a series of carved stone faces on a cliff above a river valley, he wrote, "I have been in this work for 7 years now, Padre, and I believe I can finally see the shape of it. Not the full shape, not yet, but something of the outline. What I am finding is not isolated, it is connected. The connections are not geographical, they are not trade routes or colonial roads or anything so obvious as that. The connections are in the markings themselves, in specific symbols that recur across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and apparently by thousands of years. I am building a catalog. I believe the catalog, when it is complete, will demonstrate something very significant about the history of this part of the world, and perhaps of the world itself. I am also, I confess, beginning to feel something I find more difficult to write about, a sense that the investigation is not one-directional, that as I study these sites, something, not a person, not any human agency, but something is aware of the study. This is, I recognize, a statement of the kind that would concern my superiors, and I ask you not to share this letter beyond yourself. I do not mean it as a supernatural claim. I mean it as an experiential report. When I am at these sites, there is a quality of attention in the air that I cannot account for by the usual means." This is the last letter in which he discussed the substance of his research. After 1908, his letters become sparse and increasingly personal. Weather reports, health updates, observations on the communities he was living with. When his colleague pressed him twice for updates on the research, he replied with variations on the same answer, that he was thinking carefully about what he had found and was not yet ready to discuss it. In 1911, he asked his order for permission to return to Spain. The request was refused on administrative grounds. In 1912, he requested again. He was granted permission in March and was expected to leave Bolivia in April. He did not leave Bolivia in April. He did not leave Bolivia in May. His order sent inquiries to the community where he had been stationed. He was no longer there. He had left, on foot apparently, with minimal supplies, in late March, and had not been seen since. The community believed he had set out for a site he had mentioned to a local catechist, a location in the high Puna, above the permanent snow line, that the catechist knew of but had never visited. A search was organized. His body was not found. His research notebooks, 12 volumes covering 11 years of investigation, were not found. The colleague in Madrid, to whom his letters had been addressed, died in 1924 without publishing anything about the correspondence. The letters themselves were archived with the Jesuit province's historical records in La Paz. They were first examined by a researcher in 1967. They were published in Spanish in a very limited academic edition in 1993. They have never been translated into English. What did Echeverría find at the High Puna site? What did he go looking for in March of 1912 with minimal supplies and no word to anyone of where he was going? The catechist, who was the last person to speak to him, described the conversation in a brief statement written in Aymara at the request of the order's local representative following his disappearance. The statement was translated into Spanish and filed with the case documents. The relevant portion reads, quote, "He asked me to describe the road to the place with the stones that no one visits. I described it. He asked whether the sign was there. He made a shape with his hands, a spinning thing that becomes an eye. I told him I did not know. He said that was all right, he would find out. He thanked me and left." Unquote. Part 3. The Monk of Priya Khan. Angkor Wat is one of the most studied archaeological sites in the world. The vast complex of temples built by the Khmer Empire between the 9th and 15th centuries has been photographed from every angle, measured to the millimeter, excavated carefully, and mapped comprehensively. There are almost no surprises left at Angkor Wat itself. Angkor is not only Angkor Wat. The broader Angkor archaeological landscape covers more than 400 square kilometers, within which hundreds of temple structures and complexes are distributed, ranging from the massive and famous to the small and almost entirely forgotten. The maintenance and study of this landscape is ongoing. There are temples within the Angkor complex that have never been fully documented, that are still held by the jungle, their walls cracked open by the roots of fig trees, and their chambers accessible only to those willing to climb through the vegetation. Priya Khan is one of the large and relatively well-known sites within the broader Angkor complex, a 12th century temple built by the Khmer king Jayavarman VII, large and labyrinthine, its many corridors and chambers still only partially cleared of the vegetation that grew through them during the centuries of the temple's abandonment. It is open to visitors, it is studied, it is documented. But Priya Khan, like most of the Angkor temples, has levels below the ground level. Not constructed underground chambers, not deliberately excavated spaces, but natural caves and passages in the limestone bedrock on which the temple was built, spaces that were incorporated into the temple complex during construction, that were accessed through specific passages and were used for specific purposes that the archaeological record has not fully determined. In 1994, a Cambodian monk named Venerable Prak Soka, a scholar of Khmer classical literature and Buddhist iconography who was attached to a monastery near Siem Reap and who had spent years studying the inscriptions of the Angkor temples, petitioned the EFEO, the French Archaeological Institute that had been responsible for Angkor research since the colonial period, for permission to access a specific section of the Prakan complex that was not open to visitors. A passage leading downward behind a locked door in the eastern section of the temple that the EFEO's own documentation described as unexplored beyond initial survey depth. His petition stated that he was investigating the iconographic program of the Prakan temple and believed the lower passage might contain earlier inscriptions relevant to his research. This was a reasonable scholarly claim. Permission was granted. He descended with a torch and a camera on a Tuesday morning in November of 1994. He did not return for dinner. By the following morning, the monk who had accompanied him to the temple entrance and waited outside was concerned enough to report his absence to the monastery. The EFEO was notified. A search team entered the passage. They found, approximately 40 meters in, a chamber that the initial survey had apparently not reached, a natural cave in the limestone with a roughly leveled floor and a ceiling that rose to approximately 4 meters. The chamber was approximately 10 meters across. The walls of the chamber were carved. The carvings were not Khmer. They were not in the Khmer script, not in the iconographic tradition of Khmer Buddhism, not consistent with any period or style of Khmer art. They were, in the assessment of the EFEO archaeologist who examined them, a woman named Dr. Sylvie Renard, whose brief report on the incident was filed internally and has never been published, of unknown origin and significant age, predating the construction of the Prakan temple complex by an indeterminate period. Prakso Ka was found in the chamber. He was sitting against the wall, facing the largest carved section, in a posture of contemplation. He was physically unharmed. He had apparently spent the night in the chamber. He was, by the account of everyone who interacted with him in the following hours and days, significantly altered. Not distressed, not frightened, not psychotic or delusional, simply different, quieter, as though he had heard something that had changed the frequency of his attention. He did not describe what he had experienced in the chamber. When asked directly, he said in Khmer something that his questioners translated as, "I sat with what is there." When pressed for more detail, he said, "It is not mine to describe. It is already in the world. You will encounter it." He returned to his monastery. He ceased his scholarly work on Khmer inscriptions. He spent the remaining years of his life, he died in 2003, in meditation and in teaching meditation to the monks of his community. He never wrote about what he had seen or experienced in the chamber. He never discussed it with anyone who published an account of the conversation. The chamber in the Prakan limestone was sealed by the EFEO after the search and recovery. It was not excavated. It was not further documented beyond Dr. Renard's brief report. The lock on the passage was upgraded. Dr. Renard's report, the document that described the carvings as predating the Khmer temple and being of unknown origin, was filed in the EFEO archive in Paris. A researcher who spent time with the EFEO archives in the 2010s working on an unrelated project came across the report by accident and made a note of it, though without understanding its significance in the broader context I am describing here. Part 4. Irina and the Libraries of the Altai. Irina Veselenko was a Russian archaeologist specializing in the rock art of the Altai Mountains, the range that straddles the borders of Russia, Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia, where the Siberian steppe meets the Central Asian highlands in a landscape of extraordinary ancient human density. The Altai has been inhabited by people for at least 50,000 years and possibly longer, and its rock faces are covered in petroglyphs spanning this entire period, layer upon layer of human marking, each era leaving its traces over and around and sometimes directly on top of the traces left by the eras before. Vasilenko worked in the Altai for 23 years, from 1988 to 2011, producing a substantial body of careful, methodical scholarship on specific petroglyph sites and specific iconographic traditions within the region's rock art. She was not a theorist, she was a documenter, a person whose great skill was the patient accumulation of accurate records of what was actually there, as opposed to what the investigator hoped to find. Her work took an unexpected turn in 2007 when she was conducting a standard documentation survey in a remote section of the Russian Altai, near the border with Kazakhstan, and discovered, in a canyon that her survey maps showed as blank, as if nothing were there, a system of boulders, some natural and some clearly positioned, that she described in her field journal as unlike anything else in the region. The boulders were enormous, the largest approaching 10 meters in height, and several of them had been worked on their flat upper surfaces in a way that she recognized as similar to the Naru Tash slabs she had read about in Dr. Mayer's 2005 paper. She photographed extensively, she documented carefully. She returned to the site on 5 subsequent visits over the following 2 years, gradually building a complete record of the carved surfaces. What she found in the course of this documentation was that the boulders of the canyon formed, viewed from a specific elevated position she discovered on her 3rd visit, a pattern. Not the astronomical pattern of Naru Tash, a different pattern. A pattern that, as she described in the draft paper she had begun writing by 2010, appeared to represent not the sky, but the earth, specifically the distribution of sites across a large geographic area. A map. The map was rough, or at least her interpretation of it as a map was rough. The correspondence between the boulder arrangement and actual geography was not precise enough to be unambiguous. But certain features of the arrangement were suggestive. A cluster of 3 boulders that might correspond to the 3 large Altai massifs, a curved line of smaller stones that might represent the arc of a major river, and, at specific points on the arrangement, marked with a particular symbol carved into the boulder's face, what appeared to be locations. Specific points in the landscape marked as significant. Vasilenko overlaid her interpretation of the boulder map with actual topographic data. 7 of the points she had tentatively identified as marked locations corresponded, within the precision limits of her interpretation, to known archaeological sites in the region, sites she had worked at or knew from the literature. 3 of the marked locations did not correspond to any known site. She began investigating these 3 locations in the field season of 2011. She investigated the first in June and found nothing, a hillside of undisturbed rock and scrub, no visible sign of anything. She investigated the second in July. In the field journal entry for July 23, 2011, she wrote, "3rd unmarked location investigated today. Access difficult. Canyon approach, steep descent, will document in full tomorrow." The July 24th entry exists. It is a single line. The library is real. There is no July 25th entry. There are no further field journal entries from the 2011 season. The journal was found in Vasilenko's vehicle, which was located by her university's expedition team when she failed to make scheduled contact. She was found, physically unharmed, at the site of the second boulder location, the one that had shown nothing in July, 3 days after the July 24th journal entry. She had no memory of those 3 days. She retired from field archaeology the following spring. She published one further paper in 2012, a routine documentation paper about Altai petroglyphs from earlier fieldwork, which she had apparently already drafted before the 2011 season. After 2012, she published nothing. The third boulder location, the one that prompted the journal entry, "The library is real," was revisited in 2013 by a team from Vasilenko's Institute, attempting to understand what she had found. They described, in an internal report, a canyon with carved walls. They noted that the carvings were dense and systematic, and unlike anything in the regional rock art tradition. They recommended further investigation. The further investigation has not, as of the time of this writing, occurred. The library is real. What did she mean? What had she found? A literal library? A space of accumulated, organized knowledge encoded in stone? Or something she was calling a library because no other word in her vocabulary was adequate? I cannot tell you. She has not explained. When a researcher from her former institute visited her in 2018 to discuss the 2011 events and their aftermath, she was polite and firm. She had nothing to add to the record. She was well. She had decided to spend her retirement gardening. The researcher noted in the account of the visit that she shared with me one detail that struck her as significant. In Vasilenko's garden, among the ordinary flower beds and vegetable rows, there was a section where small stones had been arranged in a specific pattern. Not decoratively, not in the casual way that people arrange garden stones. Very precisely, very deliberately. When the researcher mentioned the stone arrangement, Vasilenko looked at it for a moment and said only, "It is peaceful to look at. It helps me think clearly." The researcher photographed the stone arrangement before leaving. She sent me the photograph. It is not symbol 14. It is symbol 07.
Movement 6. Star Maps of Impossible Ages. Part 1. What the Sky Keeps. The stars are a historical record. When you look at the night sky, you are looking at different depths of time simultaneously. The moon's light left the moon about 1 1/3 seconds ago. The sun's light left the sun 8 minutes ago. The nearest star, Proxima Centauri, sent the light you see approximately 4 years ago. The Andromeda Galaxy, visible on clear nights to the naked eye as a faint smear of light, is sending you light that has been traveling for 2.5 million years. This means that the night sky, as we observe it, is not a view of the present. It is a view of different pasts stacked on top of each other, a palimpsest of time in which nearer and farther objects are simultaneously visible, each broadcasting from its own moment in the past. Ancient people understood this differently, or rather, they understood different things about it. They did not have the physics of light-speed travel. But many of them understood something else, that the stars were durable, that the stars would be there tomorrow and next year and in 1,000 years, recognizably, reliably. The sky was the one constant in a world of impermanence, the one thing that did not change on any timescale a human life could observe. They were right, largely. The stars change over geological timescales. Over millions of years, stars are born and die and move. But on human timescales, and even on civilization timescales, the sky is stable. A person looking at the Pleiades today is looking at what their ancestors looked at 10,000 years ago. The same 7 stars, the same shape, the same position relative to the other stars. Almost the same position. Precession, the slow wobble, shifts the sky by measurable amounts over centuries and millennia, by enough, as Dr. Mayer demonstrated at Naru Tash, to allow a determination of when a star map was made, if the map is precise enough and if you know what you are looking for.
Movement 6. Star Maps of Impossible Ages. Part 1. What the Sky Keeps. The stars are a historical record. When you look at the night sky, you are looking at different depths of time simultaneously. The moon's light left the moon about 1 1/3 seconds ago. The sun's light left the sun 8 minutes ago. The nearest star, Proxima Centauri, sent the light you see approximately 4 years ago. The Andromeda Galaxy, visible on clear nights to the naked eye as a faint smear of light, is sending you light that has been traveling for 2.5 million years. This means that the night sky, as we observe it, is not a view of the present. It is a view of different pasts stacked on top of each other, a palimpsest of time in which nearer and farther objects are simultaneously visible, each broadcasting from its own moment in the past. Ancient people understood this differently, or rather, they understood different things about it. They did not have the physics of light-speed travel, but many of them understood something else, that the stars were durable, that the stars would be there tomorrow and next year and in 1,000 years, recognizably, reliably. The sky was the one constant in a world of impermanence, the one thing that did not change on any timescale a human life could observe. They were right, largely. The stars change over geological timescales. Over millions of years, stars are born and die and move. But on human timescales, and even on civilization timescales, the sky is stable. A person looking at the Pleiades today is looking at what their ancestors looked at 10,000 years ago. The same 7 stars, the same shape, the same position relative to the other stars. Almost the same position. Precession, the slow wobble, shifts the sky by measurable amounts over centuries and millennia, by enough, as Dr. Mayer demonstrated at Naru Tash, to allow a determination of when a star map was made, if the map is precise enough and if you know what you are looking for. What I am about to describe are 5 star maps from 5 different locations representing 5 different periods and cultures, each of which should not exist in the form it does. Not should not exist in the sense of being impossible. Impossible is a strong word, and I try to use it carefully. Should not exist in the sense that the knowledge required to produce them, knowledge of precession, of stellar coordinates, of long cycle astronomical cycles, is knowledge that the historical record does not associate with the cultures that produced the maps, in the places and at the times where the maps were made. This is one of those problems that the framework cannot absorb without deforming, so the framework, in most cases, declines to absorb it. Part 2. The Sealing of the Huaca. In the Lambayeque region of northern Peru, between the Pacific coast and the western slopes of the Andes, there are dozens of huacas, pyramid-like ceremonial mounds built by the pre-Inca cultures of the Peruvian north coast, the Moche and their successors, the Lambayeque or Sican culture. Some of these huacas are enormous, rivaling the Egyptian pyramids in their sheer volume of material. Some are modest, smaller mounds that served local ceremonial functions. Among the smaller huacas, one was excavated in the 1980s by a Peruvian-American archaeological team working in a region that had seen intensive looting and needed systematic professional investigation. The excavation is documented in a series of reports, which are available through the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection in Washington, D.C. The reports are careful and detailed about most aspects of the site. They are oddly sparse about one discovery. On page 47 of the third excavation report, in a section titled Architectural Analysis of Chamber 7, there is a paragraph that describes the sealing of the inner chamber, a chamber that had been sealed, apparently, since the huaca was deliberately buried by its builders, a common practice in Andean ceremonial traditions. The ceiling was plastered and painted. The paint had survived, protected by the sealed conditions, in extraordinary condition, vivid reds and ochres and blacks and whites, fresh-seeming after 1,000 years of sealed darkness. The painted ceiling showed the night sky. This is not unusual in itself. Celestial imagery is common in Andean art. But the paragraph in the excavation report notes, with a restraint that seems almost carefully cultivated, that the stellar positions in the painted ceiling do not correspond to the positions of stars as visible from the Lambayeque region at the time of the Waka's construction, approximately 1000 CE, based on the associated material culture. The stellar positions in the painting correspond approximately to the sky visible from the Lambayeque region at a time approximately 7,000 years before the Waka's construction. The paragraph ends with the sentence, "The significance of this divergence from contemporary stellar positions is unclear and will require further study." The further study is not documented in subsequent reports. I spoke with one of the excavation team's members, a retired professor who wishes to remain unnamed, about this paragraph. He was one of the people who wrote it. He told me that the team had been aware of the issue but had not known what to do with it. They had consulted with 2 astronomers, both of whom confirmed the precession calculation but offered no interpretation. The team had discussed it at length and ultimately decided to note it and move on, because the alternative, publishing a prominent discussion of a finding that implied the Lambayeque culture possessed knowledge of precession 700 years before the first certain evidence of precession knowledge in any culture, would have required a level of institutional courage that the team did not collectively possess. He said, "We knew what it meant. We chose not to say so." He paused. "I still don't know if that was the right decision."
Part 3. The Bone Calendar of the Upper Lena. In 1953, a Soviet archaeological team excavating an Upper Paleolithic site on the Upper Lena River in eastern Siberia found a fragment of mammoth bone approximately 30 centimeters long and 8 centimeters wide, partially engraved. The engraving consisted of parallel lines of notches, 73 notches on one face, arranged in 7 groups, 61 notches on the other face, arranged in 5 groups, and then a different pattern. Objects like this have been found at many Upper Paleolithic sites across Eurasia. They are generally interpreted as counting tools, tally sticks, and the most common interpretation is that they were used to track lunar cycles, helping their makers maintain a calendar in a world without writing. This interpretation is supported by the observation that many such bones have notch counts that correspond to known lunar periods. The Lena bone was catalogued as a tally stick. It was filed in a Yakutsk museum's storage collection and largely forgotten for 40 years. In 1994, a Soviet-era researcher named Dr. Mikhail Bulatov, working on his retirement project of cataloging uncatalogued material in regional Siberian museum collections, examined the bone and noted something that the 1953 catalogers had not. The notch counts, 73 on one face, 61 on the other, did not correspond to any lunar cycle. The lunar synodic month is approximately 29.5 days. Multiples of 29.5 do not produce 73 or 61 by any obvious calculation. But 73 and 61 are numbers with other significance. The metonic cycle, the period after which the phases of the moon recur on the same calendar dates, is 19 years, or 235 lunar months. 135 is not 73 or 61, but 73 multiplied by the ratio of the solar year to the lunar year, rounded to the nearest integer, produces a number within 1 of 235. And 61, in certain astronomical contexts relating to the relationship between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar, appears as a correction factor. Bulatov's paper, published in a regional Siberian academic journal in 1996, cautiously proposed that the Lena bone might represent not a simple tally stick,
but a sophisticated astronomical computing device, a physical aid for tracking the relationship between solar and lunar cycles over long periods. The bone, by its archaeological context, was approximately 23,000 years old. The Metonic cycle was formally identified and named by the Greek astronomer Meton of Athens in 432 BCE, roughly 22,500 years after the Lena bone was made. Bulatov's paper was noted by a few specialists in Paleolithic cognitive studies and then set aside. He died in 2001. The bone remains in the Yakutsk Museum. Part 4. The Star Temple of Bada Valley. The Bada Valley in central Sulawesi, Indonesia, contains one of the world's least studied collections of megalithic statues. Several dozen stone figures, ranging from less than a meter to nearly 4 meters tall, humanoid in general form, but carved in a distinctive and stylized manner that has not been linked to any known sculptural tradition, stand in a highland valley surrounded by coffee plantations, their presence seemingly unknown to any culture currently living in the region. No local oral tradition accounts for them. No historical document describes their creation. They simply exist in a landscape that has grown up around them, largely unasked. The statues have been dated using available geological and contextual evidence to somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 years ago, a wide range that reflects the difficulty of dating carved stone without associated organic material. But certain researchers who have examined them closely have suggested that this dating may be too conservative, that the degree of weathering on the statue's surfaces is consistent with a much greater age than the conventional estimates allow. One of these researchers was a Dutch art historian named Dr. Annelies van der Berg, who spent 3 weeks in the Bada Valley in 2006 documenting the statues in detail that they had not previously received. Her documentation included a feature that previous researchers had noted but not investigated: the positioning of the statues in the landscape. The valley floor is not flat. The statues are distributed across it at varying elevations in groups and singly, their faces oriented in different directions. When van der Berg mapped their positions precisely and plotted them on a topographic chart, she found that the distribution was not random, and it was not organized by the most obvious principle, elevation, or grouping around water sources, or proximity to the central axis of the valley. The distribution was organized by sight lines. Specifically, from a central elevated point in the valley, a natural rise in the terrain that van der Berg identified as likely to have been accessible and used as a vantage point. The statues were arranged so that specific statues aligned, as seen from that central point, with specific points on the horizon. And the points on the horizon with which the statues aligned were the rising and setting positions of specific stars. Not the stars as they rise and set today, the stars as they would have risen and set, as seen from that valley at a specific period in the past. Van der Berg ran the precession calculations. The alignment corresponded to stellar positions from approximately 6,000 years before the present. She published her findings in a paper that appeared in an Indonesian archaeological journal in 2008. The paper attracted some attention in Indonesia and was cited by a few subsequent researchers. It has not been widely discussed in the international literature. Van der Berg's paper included a detail that she described as puzzling and possibly coincidental. On the base of 3 of the statues, the 3 that marked the alignments she considered most precise, there was a carved mark. The mark was small, easy to miss, and had not been noted in previous descriptions of the statues. She photographed the mark carefully, included the photographs in her paper, and described it as follows.
a circular or spiral form that appears to converge toward a central point with what may be a stylized ocular element at the convergence. The symbol has not been identified in any comparative typology of Austronesian or Melanesian iconography known to this researcher.
Part 5. The Map That Should Not Be. In the holdings of the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, there is a map. Most people who have heard of it know it as the Piri Reis map, named for the Ottoman admiral who compiled it in 1513 CE, and they know it as the source of one of the most persistent and hotly debated anomalies in the history of cartography. The Piri Reis map is often mentioned in connection with ancient mysteries, and usually in a way that oversimplifies what is actually interesting about it. The common claim that it accurately depicts Antarctica, including the coastline beneath the ice sheet, which would not be surveyed until the 20th century, is contested by cartographers who argue that the southern landmass on the map is a distorted representation of South America, not Antarctica. This debate has generated a great deal of heat and not much light. I am not going to focus on Antarctica. I am going to focus on something that is noted in the scholarly literature on the Piri Reis map, but rarely discussed outside it. The notation that the Ottoman admiral himself included in the margin of the map, explaining his sources. Piri Reis was an extraordinarily careful compiler. He was working from existing maps, some Portuguese, some Spanish, some from what he described as very old Arabic sources, and one that he described with unusual specificity as a map made in the time of Alexander the Great. He collated these sources, he explained, trying to produce the most accurate possible representation of the world as it was currently known. The Arabic sources he mentioned have never been specifically identified. The map attributed to the time of Alexander the Great has never been located. Most historians assume these source descriptions are approximate or metaphorical, that when Piri Reis says the time of Alexander the Great, he means a very old map, rather than literally a map from the 4th century BCE. But there are details in the Piri Reis map, details of specific coastline configurations, of specific island positions, of specific inland features visible in places where no European or Arabic explorer had reached by 1513, that correspond more accurately to ground truth than any other source from the period would allow. Not in every case, the map has many errors, but in specific, selected cases, it is more accurate than it should be. Historians of cartography have proposed various explanations, lucky guesses, misidentified features, errors that accidentally correspond. These explanations are not impossible. They are simply, cumulatively, not entirely satisfying. What Piri Reis was saying, what he believed he was saying, whatever the truth of his sources, is that some of the information in his map came from sources whose age he could not determine, that he was collating material of unknown origin and unknown age that was already old when it came to him, that had passed through Arabic intermediaries from some prior source that had itself preserved it from an earlier still. The chain of transmission he was describing goes back, at its documented end, to Greek-era sources. How much further back the undocumented chain extends is, by definition, unknown. There is a note in the margin of the Piri Reis map, a small annotation in Ottoman Turkish near the southern section of the map that has been translated by different scholars in different ways. The most literal translation, provided by a Turkish historian in a 2003 paper on the map's marginalia, reads, "The edge of the world as the first map-makers knew it, before the world was as it is now." Before the world was as it is now. What world did the first map-makers know? Part 6. A conversation about stars. In 2018, I spent several days in conversation with an elderly scholar in the city of Sana'a, Yemen. I will not give his name. He is a scholar of Islamic astronomy and of the pre-Islamic astronomical traditions of the Arabian Peninsula, and he has spent most of his adult life in libraries, working with manuscripts that few other people in the world have read. He told me about a manuscript. He had seen it only once, briefly, in a private collection in the 1980s, that described, in a style consistent with 10th or 11th century Arabic astronomical writing, a system of stellar observation based not on the stars' current positions, but on their positions before the Great Change. The manuscript, he said, was clearly a copy of an older document. It referred to itself as a copy, noted that the original was in a script the copyist could only partially read, and the astronomical system it described was not consistent with any known Arabic astronomical tradition. What made it remarkable, he said, was its treatment of a specific star group, a modest grouping in the southern sky, not part of any named Arabic constellation, not part of any navigational system he knew. The manuscript described this grouping in terms of its significance as a marker of location, not navigational location, but temporal location. The grouping marked, the manuscript said, a specific moment in the long cycle of the sky's precession, a moment that had occurred in the deep past and would recur far in the future. It described the star grouping as the eye of the clock. He had not seen the manuscript again. The private collection it had been in had been dispersed. He did not know where it was. I asked him if he could describe the star grouping. He thought for a long time, looking at his hands. Then he described 7 stars in the southern sky, in their positions relative to each other. When I cross-referenced his description later with Dr. Mayer's astronomical analysis, the grouping he described corresponded, approximately, within the limits of an old man's 40-year-old memory of a manuscript he had held briefly, to the grouping encoded in the Naru Tash stone arrangement. The grouping that no culture has named, the grouping that no mythology has claimed, the grouping that someone 11,000 years ago considered important enough to fix in 17 multi-ton stones on a wind-blasted plateau in Central Asia. The eye of the clock. Movement 7. The languages that have no parents. Part 1. On the family trees of words. Languages have genealogies. Like biological organisms, they evolve from common ancestors, diverge over time as populations separate, and occasionally cross-pollinate through contact and trade. The discipline of historical linguistics, the study of language change over time, the reconstruction of ancestral languages, the tracing of lineages, is remarkably precise, capable of identifying language relationships through the systematic correspondences of sounds and grammatical structures across related languages. This precision has allowed linguists to reconstruct with considerable confidence the ancestral languages from which the world's major language families descended. Proto-Indo-European, the common ancestor of everything from English to Hindi to Russian to Greek, is understood well enough that linguists write papers in it, fictional texts that no one living can read because the language has been dead for perhaps 6,000 years, but that can be assembled from the systematic patterns of its descendants. Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the ancestor of Chinese and Tibetan and Burmese and dozens of other languages, is less completely reconstructed, but clearly identifiable. Proto-Afro-Asiatic, the ancestor of Arabic and Hebrew and Amharic and Egyptian, is similarly understood. The families connect, in the standard model, through a genealogical tree that has become increasingly well resolved with the application of computational methods and genetic data. Language families, as we know them, are roughly 12,000 years old at the root, possibly somewhat older. their diversification corresponding to the dispersal of populations following the end of the last ice age. Beyond 12,000 years, the standard model becomes uncertain. Attempts to reconstruct proto-languages at greater time depths, what some linguists call macro-families or superfamilies, ancestral languages from which multiple of the major families might have descended, are highly controversial, largely rejected by mainstream linguistics, and almost entirely unprovable by standard methods because language changes fast enough that the systematic correspondences that allow family reconstruction become noise after roughly 8 to 10,000 years.
Movement 7. The Languages That Have No Parents. Part 1. On the Family Trees of Words. Languages have genealogies. Like biological organisms, they evolve from common ancestors, diverge over time as populations separate, and occasionally cross-pollinate through contact and trade. The discipline of historical linguistics, the study of language change over time, the reconstruction of ancestral languages, the tracing of lineages, is remarkably precise, capable of identifying language relationships through the systematic correspondences of sounds and grammatical structures across related languages. This precision has allowed linguists to reconstruct with considerable confidence the ancestral languages from which the world's major language families descended. Proto-Indo-European, the common ancestor of everything from English to Hindi to Russian to Greek, is understood well enough that linguists write papers in it, fictional texts that no one living can read because the language has been dead for perhaps 6,000 years, but that can be assembled from the systematic patterns of its descendants. Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the ancestor of Chinese and Tibetan and Burmese and dozens of other languages, is less completely reconstructed, but clearly identifiable. Proto-Afro-Asiatic, the ancestor of Arabic and Hebrew and Amharic and Egyptian, is similarly understood. The families connect in the standard model through a genealogical tree that has become increasingly well resolved with the application of computational methods and genetic data. Language families as we know them are roughly 12,000 years old at the root, possibly somewhat older, their diversification corresponding to the dispersal of populations following the end of the last ice age. Beyond 12,000 years, the standard model becomes uncertain. Attempts to reconstruct proto-languages at greater time depths, what some linguists call macro-families or superfamilies, ancestral languages from which multiple of the major families might have descended, are highly controversial, largely rejected by mainstream linguistics, and almost entirely unprovable by standard methods because language changes fast enough that the systematic correspondences that allow family reconstruction become noise after roughly 8 to 10,000 years. But there is a question that the standard model has difficulty with, and it is a question I find persistent and important. What about the languages that do not fit the genealogical tree at all? Language isolates, languages with no established relationship to any other known language, exist. The most famous is Basque, spoken in the Western Pyrenees region of Spain and France, which has resisted every attempt to link it to any other language family and is thought to represent a remnant of the pre-Indo-European languages of Europe. Sumerian is an isolate, the oldest written language in the world, with no demonstrated ancestors and no known relatives. Korean and Japanese are, despite their obvious similarities to each other, both controversial cases. Their relationship to each other and to any other language family remains debated. The Burushaski language of northern Pakistan is an isolate. The Elamite language of ancient Iran is an isolate. These isolates are distributed across the world in cultures and geographies that have no particular connection to each other. They have resisted, in many cases, decades or centuries of linguistic analysis.
They are, by definition, languages whose genealogy leads back to the edge of what can be reconstructed and then disappears into the period before 12,000 years ago, when the standard model has nothing to say. Part 2. The script on the wall. The Proto-Semitic script, the ancestor of the Phoenician alphabet, the ancestor of Greek, the ancestor of Latin, the ancestor of English, first appears in the archaeological record approximately 3,900 years ago in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, carved into stone by the Semitic workers employed in Egyptian turquoise mines. It is clearly derived, in large part, from Egyptian hieroglyphics, specific signs redeployed in a more economical and flexible system. Its origin is reasonably well understood. The Indus Valley script, the writing system of the Harappan civilization that flourished in the Indian subcontinent roughly between 2600 and 1900 BCE, has not been deciphered. It exists on thousands of stamp seals, pottery fragments, and inscribed tablets. It has been analyzed by dozens of researchers using every computational and linguistic tool available. It has resisted all of them. Nobody knows what it says. Nobody knows whether it represents a language related to any currently known language. Nobody knows whether it is a true writing system in the sense of encoding speech, or something different, a symbolic system that operated by different principles than alphabetic or syllabic script. The Linear A script of ancient Crete, the writing system of the Minoan civilization, which predates the Greek Linear B, and from which Linear B may have borrowed some signs, is similarly undeciphered. Unlike the Indus Valley script, the language it encodes is almost certainly related to other Aegean languages, but that relationship has not been established clearly enough to unlock the script's meaning. These two cases, Indus Valley and Linear A, are the famous ones, the acknowledged mysteries, the cases that appear in popular science writing and generate regular breathless announcements of claimed decipherments, none of which have survived peer review. There are others, less famous, less discussed. The Vinca symbols, found on pottery and figurines from a Neolithic culture of Southeast Europe, dated between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago, are a set of geometric signs that appear with remarkable consistency across a wide geographic area over a long period. They are not, most researchers now agree, a writing system in the full sense. They do not appear to encode speech, but they are systematic. They are intentional. They are clearly communicating something, and whatever they are communicating has not been understood. The Rongo-Rongo script of Easter Island, a system of glyphs carved into wooden tablets found among a population with no contact with any other writing-using culture, is undeciphered. The population of Easter Island had no tradition of contact with other writing systems, no plausible transmission route from any culture that used writing. Either they developed it independently, which would be an astonishing and poorly explained coincidence given how rare the independent invention of writing appears to be in human history, or they inherited it from somewhere unknown. And then there are the scripts that nobody has formally named because nobody has formally published the claim that they are scripts, the systematic markings in specific sites that share enough characteristics with writing to make the designation plausible, but that exist in contexts too anomalous and in locations too inaccessible to have attracted the sustained scholarly attention that decipherment requires. The markings in the Harat Bib chamber, the carvings in the lowest room of Agori Kagar, the canyon walls of Irina Vasilenko's library, the ceiling of the Preah Khan stone chamber. Part 3. The man who spent 30 years listening. Dr. Yusuf Adeyemi was a Nigerian linguist and archaeologist who spent most of his professional career at the University of Ibadan before retiring in 2011
and spending the last decade of his life in a quietly obsessive private research project that he described to his former students when they visited as the project I was always actually working on. He died in 2021 at the age of 78. He did not publish the results of his 30-year private project. What he left was a large archive of notes, recordings, and partially drafted papers that is currently held by his family in Lagos, and whose content a former student, Dr. Amara Osei, now a professor of African linguistics at the University of Ghana, is slowly working through with the family's permission. Osei shared portions of this archive with me. What I am about to describe is drawn from Adeyemi's notes and drafts, with the understanding that the material is preliminary, that it represents one man's thinking, not a completed and reviewed scholarly argument, and with the permission of the family. Adeyemi's project was this. He believed that the undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world, not just the famous ones, but all of them, including the informal and unnamed systems found at archaeological sites that had not attracted sufficient attention to produce a formal literature, were related. Not descended from each other in any recoverable genealogical sense, but related in the deeper sense of sharing structural principles. A common grammar, not of words, but of the logic by which symbols are organized into meaning. This is a very large claim, and Adeyemi was aware of it. His notes are full of self-admonishing asides, reminders to himself to stay grounded in evidence, to resist the temptation of overreach, to maintain the distinction between what he had found and what he wanted to find. What he had found over 30 years of painstaking comparative analysis was this. Across the undeciphered scripts and proto-scripts he had studied, he listed in a summary document approximately 40 separate systems. There were recurring structural features, not recurring symbols necessarily, though some symbols did recur. Recurring organizational principles, ways of grouping signs, ways of marking importance, ways of indicating direction, the direction of reading, the direction of a sequence. And one feature above all others that recurred with a consistency he found both exhilarating and troubling, a specific mark that he called in his notes the orienter, a sign that appeared at the beginning of significant passages, or at what he inferred to be the beginning based on contextual analysis, whose function, he believed, was to orient the reader, to say, here is where you start, and here is what direction the meaning goes. He described the orienter in his notes as a sign suggesting interior movement, the movement of attention inward, of focus converging, of something opening at the point of arrival rather than expanding outward. He drew it repeatedly in his notes, clearly trying to fix it in visual terms, each drawing slightly different, each attempting to capture the quality he kept failing to adequately render. The drawings are spirals that become eyes, convergences that become openings, the shape that every other tradition I have described calls symbol 14. His note beside one of these drawings reads, "This is not a symbol that one culture invented. This is a symbol that the human mind produces when it is trying to represent a specific concept. The question is, what concept? I have spent 30 years approaching this question. I believe the concept is, begin here, go inward, and what you find at the center will be the thing that matters." He added in a different ink, written later clearly, or the thing at the center will find you. Part 4. The Language of Stone. There is a discipline called semiotics, the study of signs and their meanings, the analysis of how meaning is generated and transmitted through symbols. Semiotic theory, at its most abstract level, is concerned not with specific symbols, but with the conditions under which anything can function as a sign, can carry meaning beyond itself. One of the foundational insights of semiotic theory is that a sign does not carry meaning inherently. A sign carries meaning in relation to a system, a code, a convention, a shared framework of interpretation within which the sign and its meaning are linked. The letter A means nothing in isolation. It means something specific to someone who knows the alphabetic code in which it participates. This insight has a troubling implication when applied to undeciphered scripts. It means that decipherment, the recovery of a script's meaning, is not simply a matter of analysis, however sophisticated. It requires a shared framework. It requires that the code in which the script operates be, in some form, accessible to the decipherer. Linear B was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris because the language it encoded turned out to be an archaic form of Greek, and Ventris was a trained classicist who knew Greek. The relationship between the symbol and its meaning was recoverable because the code was shared, because Greek, albeit in a very different form, was still a living context. The Indus Valley script has not been deciphered 50 years after serious systematic attempts began, in part because its code remains inaccessible. Whatever language it encoded, whatever framework of shared meaning connected these symbols to their meanings for their original users, is not available to modern researchers. What Adeyemi was proposing in the tentative and self-questioning language of his private notes was something more radical still. He was suggesting that the orienter, symbol 14, and the structural principles that surrounded it in the various undeciphered systems he had studied were not the symbols of a specific language, they were the framework within which a specific kind of meaning operated. A metacode. A code not for encoding specific content, but for signaling the type of content, for saying, what follows is of this kind, approach it in this way. It requires this mode of reading. The orienter in this interpretation does not have a specific lexical meaning. It does not mean a word. It means activate the mode of understanding that can receive what comes next. This is an astonishing proposal, if it is true. It suggests that whoever designed the orienter, whoever used it consistently across the 40-odd writing systems that Adeyemi surveyed, was operating with a sophisticated understanding not just of writing, but of reading, of the cognitive states required to receive certain kinds of information, of the fact that some knowledge requires not just a capable mind, but a mind in a specific condition, open, inward-focused, at what Adeyemi calls, borrowing from contemplative tradition, the point of arrival. The underground chambers with their acoustic properties, the altered states they induced, the orienter that marked what was inside them. The code was not for reading. The code was for being in the right state to receive something that does not travel through the eyes. Movement 8. The Ocean Floors and the Buried Cities. Part 1. What the water kept. The sea has been rising for 12,000 years. This is not a metaphor. At the height of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The ice sheets that covered the northern continents, sheets kilometers thick, accumulations of water so vast that their weight depressed the land beneath them, were locked in solid form on the land. The water that is now in the ocean was then in the ice. The ocean was smaller. The coasts were further out. The world's continental shelves, the shallow underwater plains that ring the continents, were exposed land. And on that land, people lived. The continental shelves of the world are not geological wastelands. They are the most productive zones of any continent's geography. Coastal lowlands, river estuaries, tidal flats, the most ecologically rich and geographically accessible terrain on Earth. In any period of human history, before or after the agricultural revolution, people preferentially inhabit the coast. The food is abundant, the water is available, the transportation is easy. Coastal living has always been, the default.
For the hundreds of thousands of years during which sea levels were lower, during the last ice age and the periods that preceded it, people were living on land that is now underwater. Tens of millions of square kilometers of productive coastland, river valleys, and lowland plains that we have never surveyed, that we cannot easily survey, that lie under between 5 and 120 meters of water, slowly dissolving, slowly being covered by sediment, slowly becoming invisible. What is on those ocean floors? We do not know. We have surveyed in detail a remarkably small fraction of the ocean floor, less than 20% by most estimates, with meaningful archaeological survey accounting for a tiny fraction of that. The ocean floor is vast and dark and cold and difficult, and underwater archaeology is extraordinarily expensive and technically demanding, and it has been focused, historically, on finding specific things in known places, shipwrecks, lost harbors, documented ancient cities, rather than systematically surveying unknown terrain for unknown remains. Some things have been found anyway, by accident, by fishermen whose nets caught on something, by recreational divers who happened to be in the right depth, by researchers whose instruments returned unexpected readings. Part 2. The structures in the Yonaguni Bank. The Yonaguni Formation, a set of underwater rock terraces and would appear to be architectural features lying at depths of 5 to 30 meters off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost island of Japan, is one of the most argued about underwater discoveries of recent decades. Discovered by a dive instructor in 1987, it has been claimed by some as evidence of an ancient submerged civilization and dismissed by others as a natural rock formation, layered sandstone that has fractured along natural plains, producing shapes that look architectural but were made by geological processes. The debate has been productive in one sense. It has forced serious engagement with the question of what distinguishes natural from artificial stone formations, which is genuinely a difficult question in many contexts. It has been unproductive in another sense. The argument has become so polarized and so associated with non-mainstream claims that careful researchers have largely stopped engaging with the Yonaguni Formation at all, because any engagement is perceived as taking a side in a debate that has become tribal rather than scientific. I am not going to resolve that debate here, but I want to make a specific observation about one feature of the Yonaguni Formation that has received less attention than the general debate about its natural or artificial origin. On the main platform of the formation, the largest of the flat stone terraces at a depth of approximately 25 meters, there are carvings. Not just the natural fractures and ledges that constitute the main focus of the natural versus artificial debate. Actual carvings, marks in the stone that are inconsistent with natural fracturing, that require a tool and a hand and intention to explain. These carvings are acknowledged, even by researchers who believe the overall formation is natural, as artificial. They are not disputed. They are simply set aside, treated as the work of historical period divers or fishermen, marking the natural formation in historical times, not significant in the context of the bigger question. But they have been photographed, and one of the photographs, taken by a Japanese underwater photographer named Araki Nobuhiro in 2003, who published a book of underwater photography that included several Yonaguni images, shows a carving on the main platform surface that is not consistent with the casual marking of fishermen. It is too deliberate, too carefully made, too clearly a specific symbol. Araki's book is in Japanese and has not been translated. The image in question is on page 47. I have seen a reproduction. The carving is small, perhaps 20 centimeters across, obscured by algal growth in parts of its surface. But its shape is clear, a spiral that converges to a central point, with a form at the center that reads as an eye. Part 3. The Gulf of Cambay. In January of 2002, the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India, conducting marine surveys in the Gulf of Khambat, formerly known as the Gulf of Cambay, off the coast of the Indian state of Gujarat, detected, using side-scan sonar, two large anomalies on the ocean floor. The anomalies were at a depth of approximately 40 meters and extended over an area of several square kilometers. Their shape on the sonar readout suggested regular rectilinear features, the kind of geometry associated with architecture rather than geology. Subsequent dredging operations recovered artifacts from the site: pottery fragments, worked stone, wood fragments, subsequently carbon dated to approximately 9,500 years before the present, and what appeared to be human skeletal material. This was, by any ordinary assessment, an extraordinary discovery. A 9,500-year-old archaeological site, submerged 40 meters beneath the Gulf of Khambat, with architecture detectable by sonar and artifacts recoverable by dredging. The site, if the initial assessment was correct, would be older than anything in the standard narrative of South Asian civilization by approximately 4,000 years. The discovery was announced at a press conference in January of 2002 by S.N. Rajguru, an archaeological advisor to the Indian government. It was covered by international media briefly. Then, for reasons that remain somewhat unclear, the investigation largely stalled. Follow-up diving surveys were announced, but not, as far as the public record indicates, completed. The artifacts recovered by dredging were not comprehensively analyzed and published. The site was not designated for protection or systematic excavation. The scientific community's engagement with the claim was largely skeptical, focusing on the methodological limitations of side-scan sonar interpretation and the problems with artifact attribution from dredged material. The site, if the initial assessment was correct, would be older than anything in the standard narrative of South Asian civilization by approximately 4,000 years. The site, as far as I can determine, remains uninvestigated beyond the initial survey. The sonar data remains. The carbon-dated wood remains. The questions remain. A documentary filmmaker who attempted to dive at the site in 2005, making the attempt independently with a small boat and personal diving equipment, reported that the site was in an area of very poor visibility due to silt and currents. She reached the seafloor in approximately the area indicated by the sonar data. She reported seeing, through the murk, what appeared to be regular stone formations, possibly walls, possibly natural. She was unable to stay long enough or see clearly enough to be certain. She filmed what she could. Her footage, viewed on a laptop in poor light in a hotel room in Ahmedabad, shows, in one moment, for approximately 3 seconds, something on the seafloor that is clearer than the rest. A flat surface, stone, partially buried. On the surface, a mark. She pointed her camera at it and held it there for those 3 seconds before the current took her. She described the mark to me, a spiral that draws inward, an opening at the center.
Part 4. The City Under the Black Sea. The Black Sea was not always a sea. 12,000 years ago, it was a freshwater lake, large but entirely enclosed, fed by rivers and disconnected from the world ocean by the land bridge that then existed where the Bosporus Strait now opens. The Bosporus region was dry land. People lived on it. Then, approximately 8,200 years ago, give or take the error margin in various dating methodologies, the land bridge failed. The Mediterranean Sea, swollen with meltwater from the retreating glaciers, broke through. Geologists Ryan and Pittman, who published this model in 1997 in a paper that generated enormous public attention and some scientific controversy, estimated the inflow was approximately 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. The freshwater lake became a saltwater sea.
The former lake floor, the land that had been above water, the land that people had lived on, the coastal lowlands of the ancient Black Sea basin, was submerged permanently. The Black Sea's great depth, it reaches over 2 kilometers, and its unique chemistry, the deep waters are anoxic, devoid of oxygen, hostile to the organic decay that destroys archaeological material elsewhere, mean that anything submerged in its deeper regions has been preserved in extraordinary condition. Organic material, wood, textile, leather, bone, that would dissolve or decay in normal marine conditions survives in the Black Sea's deep anaerobic environment. Underwater surveys of the Black Sea shelf, the relatively shallow coastal regions where prehistoric coastal communities would have lived, have, since the late 1990s, found numerous structures and artifacts on the seafloor. In 2000, a research team led by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who found the Titanic, used remotely operated vehicles to survey the Black Sea shelf off the coast of what is now Bulgaria and Turkey, and found, at various depths corresponding to different periods of the post-flood drowning, evidence of ancient habitation, stone structures, worked wooden beams, pottery. One finding from the 2000 survey was described in a brief passage in Ballard's expedition report that did not receive significant coverage in a subsequent press reporting. At a depth of approximately 95 meters in a section of the survey area that corresponded roughly to the pre-flood coastline of the region, the ROV cameras captured images of a stone feature that the expedition report described as a possible constructed platform or terrace approximately 15 meters in diameter with regular surface features suggestive of intentional modification. Associated with this feature, within a few meters of the edge of the platform structure, lying on the sediment, were several stone slabs. Each slab was flat, large, and appeared to have markings on its upper surface. The ROV cameras documented these slabs in passing, without pausing for extended documentation. In the ROV footage, archived and available to researchers who know to ask for it, in the collection of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, there is one moment of several seconds where the camera passes close to the largest slab and the marking on its surface is visible. The resolution is limited by the depth and the water clarity, but the marking is recognizable. It is the nested arcs, the careful spacing, the small vertical marks along the outer curve. It is symbol 07. Part 5. The Drowned Landscape. I want to pause here, in the middle of this account, and ask you to hold something. We have been visiting sites with specific findings, specific people who found them, specific problems with the explanations that conventional frameworks provide. Each site has its own particularity, its own local character, its own specific mystery. But under all of it, the organizing principle that gives this account its shape is something larger than any specific site. The landscape in which all of this is embedded, the world in which the Naru Tash complex was built, in which the chambers of Harat Dib were carved, in which the oral traditions of the Evenki and the Muda and the Bunurong and the Tsimane and the Twa were first spoken, was not the world as it is now. It was a colder world, a world with ice sheets kilometers deep over the northern and southern continents, a world with coastlines far out on what are now subterranean shelves, a world with sea levels 120 meters below the present, a world with rivers that no longer exist in valleys that are now under ocean, draining lakes that are now under ocean into estuaries that are now under ocean. The world before 12,000 years ago, the world in which the ice retreated and the seas rose and the landscape of human habitation was transformed globally in a few thousand years, is a world we have barely begun to study, because almost all of it is underwater. The sites we have been visiting, the ones on land, the ones that are still accessible, are the minority. The fragments that survived the flooding by virtue of being inland, elevated, away from the coasts that were swamped as the ice retreated and the sea rose to its present level.
What is underwater is the majority of the world that existed between 20,000 and 12,000 years ago, the world at the height of and immediately following the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were lowest and the exposed land area was greatest, is underwater. 120 meters down in some cases, preserved in some cases by the particular chemistry of deep anaerobic water. Invisible in most cases because we have not looked. Whatever happened in that world, whatever the Sengilan were, whatever the stone writers carved, whatever left symbol 07 and symbol 14 across the surfaces of the world, it happened mostly in a world that is now a seafloor. This is not despair, it is scale. We are not finding the edge of the mystery. We are finding the parts of it that the ocean left us above the high water mark in the places that were too elevated to drown. The rest is still there, waiting in the dark and the cold and the extraordinary preservation of deep anaerobic water for the instruments and the will and the curiosity to find it.